In this video, we're going to break down 2 hours of Peter Griffin theories. Let's get started. First up, we got Peter's heightened reality theory, the dark reality behind Peter Griffin's mind. In August 2012, a Reddit user named blank0308 posted a theory to the r divided by fan theories subreddit that would change the way thousands of fans viewed Family Guy forever. The theory asked a simple question: how can the Griffin family get into impossible situations with no consequences, episode after episode, year after year? The answer, according to this fan theory, is darker than anyone expected. Everything happening in Family Guy might be taking place inside Peter Griffin's broken mind. For more than 2 decades, the characters of Seth MacFarlane's Family Guy have put themselves through increasingly absurd situations. Peter has fought a giant chicken across multiple dimensions. The family has died and come back to life countless times. Stewie has built time machines in his bedroom. However, in the world of the show, they can get away with just about everything and be fine in the next episode. This fan theory suggests there is a tragic reason why the laws of reality do not apply to the Griffin family. The tragic truth about the Griffin children. According to the theory, in the real world before Peter went insane, his children were very different from what we see on the show. Meg Griffin was not the ugly, unpopular outcast that everyone makes fun of. In reality, Meg was a beautiful and popular teenage girl. She was at the prime of her life in high school. Everyone loved her. She had friends. She had confidence. She was the complete opposite of the Meg we know from the show. Chris Griffin was also different in the real world. The theory suggests that Chris was born with a mental disability. He did not get enough oxygen during his birth, which resulted in intellectual problems throughout his life. This is interesting because in the show, Chris is often depicted as slow-witted and unintelligent. The theory takes this characterization and gives it a darker backstory. In the real world, Chris genuinely had developmental issues that required special care and attention. Meg had a special bond with her younger brother, Chris. She loved him deeply and could not stand the fact that Chris did not receive the same attention and love that she received from everyone, including their parents. She was protective of him. She cared for him. She wanted to make sure he had a good life despite his challenges. This caring nature would ultimately lead to the most tragic event in the Griffin family history. The night everything changed. One night, Meg decided to take Chris to a party. She wanted him to experience normal teenage life. She wanted him to have fun and feel included. However, the night took a terrible turn. At the party, Meg began drinking heavily. Meanwhile, Chris started having a panic attack. The environment was too overwhelming for him. The noise, the people, the chaos of a teenage party was more than he could handle. Meg realized she needed to get Chris home immediately, but she was drunk. She should not have been driving. However, in her intoxicated state and her desperate need to help her brother, she got behind the wheel anyway. She tried to drive them home to safety. The result was catastrophic. Meg totaled the car in a drunk driving accident. Both she and Chris died in the crash. The theory suggests this is why Peter treats Meg so horribly in the show. Deep down in his broken mind, he blames her for everything that happened. He resents her for driving drunk. He resents her for getting them both killed. Even though part of him remembers how wonderful she was, the anger and resentment overwhelm those good memories most of the time. Lois's devastating choice. The tragedy did not end with the car accident. When Lois Griffin learned that both of her children had died, she could not handle the grief. She was pregnant at the time with a 3rd child that they had planned to name Stewie. The loss of Meg and Chris was too much for her to bear. Unable to cope with the devastating grief of losing 2 children, Lois made a heartbreaking decision. Lois committed suicide while she was still pregnant with Stewie. This means Stewie was never born in the real world. He never got the chance to live. Peter lost his wife and his unborn son on top of losing his 2 older children. In a matter of a short time, Peter's entire family was gone. Every person he loved most in the world was dead. Peter's descent into madness. The loss of his entire family broke Peter completely. He could not accept the reality of what had happened. His mind could not process the trauma. Unable to cope with the deaths of everyone he loved, Peter slowly slipped into insanity. His brain created a defense mechanism. It built a fantasy world where his family was still alive. According to the theory, Peter is now in a mental institution. The events we see in Family Guy are not really happening. They are all taking place inside Peter's mind as he sits in a hospital room, completely detached from reality. His brain has constructed an elaborate fantasy where his wife and children are alive, where they live in their house in Quahog, where life goes on as normal. But the fantasy is not perfect. Peter's subconscious feelings leak through. His resentment toward Meg manifests as the constant bullying and abuse she receives in the show. His anger at Lois for taking her own life and killing their unborn child manifests as Stewie's constant plots to kill his mother. His own feelings of failure as a father and husband manifest as his complete stupidity and incompetence in the show. Why Meg is treated so badly. This theory provides a dark explanation for one of Family Guy's most consistent running gags. Meg is treated terribly by everyone, especially her own family. Peter insults her, ignores her, and openly tells her he does not love her. The rest of the family joins in on the abuse. Even strangers treat Meg with contempt. The show has made Meg's suffering into comedy for over 2 decades. But according to this theory, there is a tragic reason behind this treatment. Peter still resents Meg because she was driving drunk the night of the accident. In his broken mind, he blames her for the deaths of everyone. She was responsible. She made the choice to drink. She made the choice to drive. She killed herself, Chris, and indirectly caused Lois to commit suicide. However, the theory also explains the rare moments when Peter shows genuine affection toward Meg. There are episodes where Peter bonds with Meg. In Road to Rupert, Peter and Meg become secretly best friends. Peter tells her he will still pick on her in front of others, but they are secretly close. In another episode, Peter tells Meg, "I love you too, sweetheart. None of the past matters," when she says she loves him. These moments represent Peter's true feelings breaking through the fantasy. Deep down, he remembers the real Meg. He remembers how beautiful, popular, and caring she was. He remembers how much she loved her brother. But his anger and grief are too powerful. They dominate his fantasy most of the time. Only occasionally does the love he felt for the real Meg surface through the madness. Stewie's intelligence explained. Stewie Griffin is perhaps the most unusual character in Family Guy. He is a baby who can talk, build complex machinery, create time machines, and plot elaborate schemes. His intelligence is far beyond any normal human, let alone a 1-year-old infant. The theory provides a heartbreaking explanation for Stewie's genius. Peter never got to meet his son Stewie in the real world. Stewie died before he was born when Lois took her own life. Peter had hopes and dreams for this child. He wondered what Stewie would become. He imagined his son's potential. In his fantasy world, Peter makes Stewie incredibly intelligent because he likes to believe his unborn son had great potential. Stewie represents everything Peter wished his son could have been. The boy is a genius. He can do anything. He has unlimited potential. This is how Peter chooses to remember the child he never got to meet. Rather than accepting that Stewie never lived, Peter imagines a version of his son who is extraordinary in every way. Stewie's hatred of Lois. Another key aspect of Stewie's character is his constant desire to kill Lois. Throughout the series, especially in earlier seasons, Stewie plots his mother's death. He builds weapons. He creates elaborate plans. He openly discusses wanting to murder her. This is played for comedy in the show, but the theory suggests a much darker origin for this behavior. Peter's resentment toward Lois also builds up in his image of Stewie. Peter is angry at Lois for taking her own life. He is angry that she killed herself while pregnant, taking their unborn son with her. In Peter's broken mind, he makes Stewie hate Lois and want her dead because that is how Peter feels about what she did. This also explains why Stewie never ages in the show. In Peter's fantasy, he keeps Stewie as a baby forever. Stewie remains frozen in time as the infant Peter never got to raise. The boy never grows up. He never gets older. He stays exactly as Peter imagines him, eternally young. Because Peter never had the chance to see him grow in real life. Peter's stupidity is self-punishment. One of the most interesting aspects of the theory is how it explains Peter's own character. In the show, Peter Griffin is incredibly stupid. He makes terrible decisions. He causes disasters. He cannot think ahead. He acts without considering consequences. He is often described as intellectually disabled, which was confirmed in the episode Petarded, when Peter takes an IQ test and scores below 70. But according to the theory, Peter was not like this in real life. The real Peter Griffin was actually an intelligent man. He was capable and smart. However, after losing his family, Peter feels like a complete failure. He believes he failed in his role as a father and husband. He was unable to protect his children. He was unable to keep his wife from taking her own life. This guilt and self-loathing manifests in his fantasy. Peter turns himself into the complete idiot that he perceives himself to be. He punishes himself by making himself stupid, incompetent, and foolish. Every dumb decision Peter makes in the show is a reflection of how Peter sees himself after his failures. Brian represents Peter's lost intelligence. If Peter was intelligent in real life, but makes himself stupid in his fantasy, where did that intelligence go? The theory suggests that Peter created a different personality to express the intelligent man he had always been. That personality is the family dog, Brian Griffin. Brian is often portrayed as the most intelligent member of the Griffin household. He is well-read, he is cultured, he writes novels, he engages in intellectual conversations, he is the voice of reason. While Peter is foolish and impulsive, Brian is thoughtful and rational. The theory suggests that Brian is essentially Peter's intelligence split off into a separate character. This is why Brian and Peter are best friends in the show. They are actually two halves of the same person. Peter's idiocy and Brian's intelligence are two sides of who Peter really is. In his fantasy, he has separated these aspects of himself into two different beings. The friends who visit. The theory also addresses Peter's friends, Cleveland Brown, Glenn Quagmire, and Joe Swanson. According to the theory, these men are all real people in Peter's life. Cleveland and Quagmire were actually Peter's neighbors before the tragedy. They were real friends who lived in the same neighborhood. Their appearances in the show represent the times they visit Peter in the mental hospital where he now resides. They come to see their old friend who has lost his mind. They sit with him. They talk to him. In Peter's fantasy, he transforms these visits into adventures at the Drunken Clam or various escapades around Quahog. Joe Swanson is slightly different. According to the theory, Peter has never actually met Joe in real life. However, Cleveland and Quagmire tell Peter about their neighbor Joe when they visit him. They describe Joe as a police officer who is paralyzed but remains strong and heroic. Joe is a good father and husband despite his disability. Peter takes this description and incorporates Joe into his fantasy. He creates this character based on what he has been told. Joe represents the father and husband that Peter wishes he could have been. Joe is strong, heroic, responsible, and capable. He is everything Peter believes he failed to be. Cleveland's departure. The theory provides an explanation for why Cleveland Brown eventually left Family Guy to star in his own show, The Cleveland Show. According to the theory, this happened because Cleveland eventually stops visiting Peter in the mental hospital. The reason Cleveland stops visiting is tragic. As he indulges Peter's fantasy during his visits, Cleveland starts to feel himself losing touch with reality too. He begins to feel like he might go insane himself if he continues to play along with Peter's delusions. For his own mental health, Cleveland decides he needs to take a break from visiting Peter. When Cleveland stops coming to visit, Peter's mind has to explain this absence. So in his fantasy, Peter creates the Cleveland Show. He imagines that Cleveland has moved away to a different town. This allows Peter to explain why he does not see Cleveland anymore, without having to confront the painful reality that his friend has abandoned him. The episodes get more absurd over time. Fans of Family Guy have noticed that the show has become increasingly bizarre over the years. Early seasons were relatively grounded in reality. The situations were exaggerated but somewhat plausible. As the seasons progressed, the show became more and more surreal. Characters survive impossible situations. The laws of physics do not apply. Reality itself seems to break down. The theory suggests this is because Peter is getting more insane over time. As his mental state deteriorates further, his fantasies become more disconnected from reality. The increasingly absurd situations in later seasons reflect Peter's mind falling deeper into madness. He is losing his grip on what is real and what is not. This is why characters can die and come back to life. This is why Peter can fight a giant chicken across time and space. This is why Stewie can build impossible devices. None of it has to make sense because it is all happening in the mind of a man who is completely detached from reality. Evidence Within, the show. While this theory was created by a fan and is not officially confirmed, supporters point to certain moments in the show that seem to support it. The rare moments of compassion Peter shows to Meg could be seen as glimpses of his true feelings. The inconsistencies in the show's continuity could be explained by Peter's deteriorating mental state affecting his fantasy. The fact that Peter was officially diagnosed as intellectually disabled in Petarded supports the idea that his stupidity is a specific choice, not just a character trait. The episode Seahorse Seashell Party shows Meg finally standing up to her family and calling them out for their abuse, which could represent Peter's guilt momentarily breaking through. Episodes where the family seems to acknowledge the absurdity of their situation could be read as Peter's subconscious trying to make sense of his own fantasy. The occasional fourth wall breaking and meta-humor could be Peter's mind trying to understand that what he is experiencing is not real. The viral spread of the theory. The theory gained massive popularity beyond Reddit. In late 2022, the theory went viral on TikTok. A video discussing the theory received over 4.9 million views. Users encouraged others to look it up, calling it one of the scariest theories about Family Guy ever. The video was captioned, "A Family Guy theory from 9 years ago still scares me till this day." The theory resonated with viewers because it recontextualizes the entire show. It takes a comedy that seems to be purely about absurdist humor and gives it a tragic emotional core. Every joke about Meg becomes heartbreaking. Every stupid thing Peter does becomes an act of self-punishment. The entire show transforms from mindless entertainment into a study of grief and mental illness. Why the theory matters. Whether this theory is true or not does not really matter. What matters is how it changes the way we think about the characters and their relationships. It adds depth to a show that is often criticized for being shallow. It gives meaning to running gags that seem cruel and pointless. The theory also highlights how fans engage with media. They create their own interpretations. They find deeper meanings. They connect dots that may or may not have been intended by the creators. This fan theory has become part of Family Guy's cultural legacy, regardless of whether Seth MacFarlane ever intended any of it. The Peter is going insane theory reminds us that even in the most absurd comedy, we can find tragedy. Even in the most ridiculous characters, we can find humanity. And even in a show about a talking dog and a genius baby, we can find a story about grief, loss, and the lengths a broken mind will go to avoid facing unbearable reality. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Peter's true paternity, the Mickey McFinnigan lineage. Peter's true paternity. The Mickey McFinnigan lineage. For most of his life, Peter Griffin believed that Francis Griffin was his father. Francis was a strict Irish-American Catholic who raised Peter with harsh discipline and religious devotion. Their relationship was rocky. Francis constantly criticized Peter. He called him names. He hit people with his Bible when they disagreed with him. He was not a warm or loving father figure, but Peter still believed Francis was his biological dad. Everything changed during Meg's 17th birthday party. The truth about Peter's real father would come out in the most unexpected way possible. This revelation would not only change how Peter saw himself, but it would also raise serious questions about his entire family history and the long line of Griffin ancestors he had always claimed as his own. The night Francis Griffin died, Meg's 17th birthday party was supposed to be a simple celebration. Peter and Lois threw together a party that Meg thought was too childish for her age. They got the number of candles wrong. They planned games like pin the tail on the donkey. Meg was not happy about any of it. She complained that her parents did not know her well enough to plan an appropriate party for a 17-year-old girl. Peter decided to dress up as a clown to entertain the guests. He called himself Pea Pants, the inebriated hobo clown. He got drunk during the party, very drunk. In his intoxicated state, Peter thought it would be funny to ride a unicycle down the stairs. It was a terrible idea. Peter could barely stand up straight, let alone balance on a unicycle. Peter mounted the unicycle at the top of the stairs. He tried to ride it down. Immediately, he lost control. The unicycle went flying. Peter tumbled through the air. He crashed down the stairs in a chaotic mess of limbs and metal. When he finally stopped falling, Peter landed directly on top of his father, Francis Griffin. The impact was devastating. Francis was an elderly man. He could not withstand the weight of Peter crashing down on him at full force. Francis suffered crushed ribs, a busted spleen, and a punctured lung. The family rushed him to the hospital, but his injuries were too severe. Francis Griffin was going to die. Francis's final words. In the hospital, the Griffin family gathered around Francis's bed. Everyone knew these were his final moments. Francis opened his eyes one last time. He looked directly at Peter. With his dying breath, Francis spoke his final words to the son he had raised for over 40 years. "Peter," Francis whispered weakly, "you're a fat, stinkin' drunk." Then Francis Griffin died. Those were the last words he ever spoke. After everything they had been through together, after raising Peter from childhood, Francis's final message to Peter was an insult. It was harsh. It was cruel. It was very much in character for Francis Griffin, who had never been particularly kind or supportive. Peter was devastated by his father's death. He blamed himself. He blamed alcohol. Peter decided he would never drink again. He swore off beer completely. But Peter needed something to replace the alcohol. His solution was to start smoking crack cocaine instead. Brian pointed out that crack was not a good substitute for alcohol. Peter did not care. He was high out of his mind, completely disconnected from reality. The hypnotherapy session. Brian realized that Peter needed serious help. He was dealing with grief in all the wrong ways. Brian suggested that Peter visit a hypnotherapist to work through his feelings about Francis's death. Peter agreed to go. He met with Bruce, a hypnotherapist who would help Peter uncover buried memories from his childhood. During the hypnotherapy session, Bruce guided Peter into a deep state of relaxation. He asked Peter to think back to his childhood, to remember his relationship with Francis, to explore any hidden memories that might be causing him pain. What Peter discovered would change everything he thought he knew about his family. Under hypnosis, Peter began to remember things he had forgotten, or perhaps things he had blocked out. He saw memories of himself as a young boy. In these memories, Francis was telling Peter something important, something Peter's mind had suppressed for decades. "I'm not your father," Francis shouted in the memory. Peter saw this memory repeat in different forms. Francis had told him this truth multiple times throughout his childhood. Peter had always known, somewhere deep in his subconscious, that Francis was not his biological father, but he had buried this knowledge. He had refused to accept it. Now, finally, the truth was coming to the surface. When Peter emerged from hypnosis, he was shocked. Francis was not his real father. If Francis was not his dad, then who was? Peter needed answers. He went to the one person who could tell him the truth, his mother, Thelma Griffin. Thelma reveals the truth. Peter confronted his mother about what he had remembered under hypnosis. Thelma could no longer hide the truth. She sat Peter down and told him the story of his real father. It was a story about a vacation in Ireland 40 years earlier. A story about a one-night stand. A story about a secret she had kept for Peter's entire life. Thelma explained that she had gone on a vacation to Ireland many years ago. While she was there, she met an Irish man. This man was charming in his own way. They spent time together. One thing led to another, and Thelma had an affair with this Irishman. When she returned home from Ireland, she discovered she was pregnant with Peter. Thelma never told Francis the truth about Peter's real father. She let Francis believe that Peter was his biological son. Francis raised Peter as his own child, even though he was not actually Peter's father. The Irish man from Thelma's vacation never knew he had a son. He stayed in Ireland. Thelma stayed in America. They never saw each other again. Peter asked the obvious question, who was this man? What was his name? Where could Peter find him? Thelma told Peter that his biological father's name was Mickey McFinnigan. He still lived in Ireland, in a small village called McSwiggan Village. If Peter wanted to meet his real father, he would have to travel across the ocean to find him. The journey to Ireland. Peter and Brian immediately decided to travel to Ireland. They needed to find Mickey McFinnigan. Peter needed to meet his biological father face to face. They flew to Ireland and arrived in McSwiggan Village, a stereotypical small Irish village full of exactly the kinds of Irish stereotypes you would expect in a Family Guy episode. Peter and Brian started asking the locals if they knew Mickey McFinnigan. Everyone in the village knew him. But when they described who Mickey was, Peter became horrified. Mickey McFinnigan was the town drunk. In most places, being known as the town drunk would be shameful. But in this particular Irish village, it was actually considered an honorable position. The townspeople respected Mickey for his drinking abilities. The locals directed Peter and Brian to Wifey McBeaty's tavern, where Mickey spent most of his time. Peter and Brian entered the pub and finally laid eyes on Mickey McFinnigan for the first time. What Peter saw was shocking. Mickey looked almost exactly like Peter himself. Mickey was a large, overweight man with the same body type as Peter, the same facial features, the same general appearance. The only real differences were Mickey's big red beard and his Irish accent. Mickey also had a talking sheep named O'Brien. This sheep was essentially the Irish version of Brian. O'Brien even had similar mannerisms to Brian. It was like looking at a mirror version of Peter's own life, but in Irish form. The drinking contest. Peter approached Mickey and introduced himself. He explained that he was Mickey's son, that Thelma Griffin had told him the truth about his biological father, that Peter had traveled all the way from America to Ireland to meet him. Mickey did not believe Peter's story. He refused to accept that this American stranger was really his son. Mickey had no memory of Thelma, or if he did remember her, he was not admitting it. He thought Peter was lying or confused. Mickey told Peter to leave him alone, but Peter was not going to give up that easily. He needed to prove to Mickey that they were related. Peter had an idea. He challenged Mickey to a drinking contest. Peter figured that if he could match Mickey's legendary drinking abilities, it would prove that Peter was truly Mickey's son. Only someone with McFinnigan blood could possibly drink as much as Mickey McFinnigan himself. Mickey accepted the challenge. The entire bar gathered to watch. Peter and Mickey sat down across from each other. The drinks started flowing, shot after shot after shot. Both men drank enormous amounts of alcohol. They kept going long past what normal people could handle. They drank until they could barely speak. Their words became gibberish. They could barely sit upright. Finally, Mickey passed out. He hit the table, unconscious. A moment later, Peter also passed out. The contest was technically a tie, but Mickey had passed out first. Peter had won by a split second. Mickey accepts Peter as his son. When Mickey woke up, he looked at Peter with new eyes. Nobody but a member of his own family could have beaten him in a drinking contest. Mickey finally believed that Peter was telling the truth. Peter really was his biological son. Mickey was proud. He welcomed Peter as his son. The entire bar celebrated. They sang songs together. Peter and Mickey bonded over their shared love of drinking and their similar personalities. Peter finally had a real father who was actually like him, someone who understood him, someone who shared his qualities. Brian pointed out something important to Peter. Yes, Mickey was his biological father, but Francis had raised Peter. Francis had been there for Peter's entire childhood. Francis had fed him, clothed him, and provided for him. Even if Francis was mean and harsh, he had still done his duty as a father. Deep down, Francis must have really loved Peter, even if he never showed it in a healthy way. Peter accepted this truth. He realized he could appreciate both fathers. Mickey was his real biological father, and that connection was important. But Francis had raised him, and that meant something too. Peter did not have to choose between them. He could accept both as part of his story, the mystery of the Griffin name. But Peter's discovery of his true paternity raised a serious question, a question that nobody in the show has ever fully answered. If Peter's real father is Mickey McFinnigan, then why is Peter's last name Griffin? Why did Peter grow up with the Griffin surname instead of the McFinnigan surname? The most likely explanation is that Thelma and Francis were already married when Peter was born. Or, at least, Thelma let everyone believe that Francis was Peter's father. So Peter was given the Griffin family name. He grew up as Peter Griffin, not Peter McFinnigan. Francis raised him as a Griffin. Everyone assumed Peter was a Griffin by blood, But this creates an even bigger mystery. Throughout the series, Peter has mentioned numerous ancestors. He has talked about his family history going back hundreds and even thousands of years. Peter has claimed ancestors like Moses Griffin, King Arthur Griffin, Ulysses S. Griffin, Peter Hitler, Adolf Hitler's brother, Angus Griffin, Nate Griffin, and many others. Every single one of these ancestors carries the Griffin surname. Every single one of them looks remarkably similar to Peter himself. They all have the same body type, the same face, the same general appearance. But if Peter is not actually a Griffin by blood, how can all these Griffin ancestors look exactly like him? The ancestor problem. This is the central mystery that fans have debated for years. The Family Guy wiki itself acknowledges this problem. The official wiki states, in multiple episodes, Peter talks about his relatives and ancestors, all of which share the name Griffin, not McFinnigan. This makes little sense, seeing that all these relatives have almost perfect resemblance to Peter. There are a few possible explanations for this mystery. Theory 1. Peter made them up. One possibility is that Peter simply made up most of his ancestors, or he imagined them. Throughout Family Guy, Peter often tells stories about his family history in cutaway gags. These cutaways might not be literal truth. They might be Peter's imagination running wild. Peter could be inventing ancestors and giving them the Griffin name because that is the name he grew up with. The Family Guy wiki suggests this possibility. It is a possibility that many of Peter's other relatives may have been made up, as they all carry the last name Griffin, yet share the physical attributes of Mickey, though they could have just appeared that way from Peter's imagination. If Peter's ancestors are mostly fictional or exaggerated, then the surname problem disappears. Peter can claim whatever ancestors he wants in his made-up stories. The fact that they are all named Griffin would just be part of Peter's fantasy. Theory 2. Common ancestor. Another popular theory is that the Griffin and McFinnigan families share a common ancestor. Maybe centuries ago, the two family lines were connected. Then they split into separate branches. One branch became the Griffins. The other branch became the McFinnigans. But both families retained the same physical characteristics because of their shared ancestry. The Family Guy wiki presents this theory. It is conceivable that the Griffins and the McFinnigans share a common ancestor, especially since Nate Griffin, Peter Griffin, and Mickey McFinnigan all look practically identical in shape and size. This theory is supported by the fact that Nate Griffin, Peter's black slave ancestor, also looks exactly like Peter and Mickey. Nate Griffin was supposedly a Griffin by name, but he has the same body type and facial features as Mickey McFinnigan. This suggests that maybe the Griffin and McFinnigan families were connected long ago, before they split into separate lines. If this theory is correct, then Peter is both a Griffin and a McFinnigan through different branches of the same family tree. His ancestors named Griffin would actually be distant relatives of Mickey McFinnigan's ancestors. They would all share the same genes, which is why they all look the same. Theory 3. Thelma's first husband was a Griffin. Another possibility is that Thelma was married to a Griffin before she married Francis. Maybe Thelma's first husband was a Griffin. When that relationship ended through death or divorce, Thelma kept the Griffin name. Then she had her affair with Mickey and got pregnant with Peter. Then she married Francis, who was not a Griffin. This would explain why Peter has the Griffin surname even though his biological father is Mickey McFinnigan. Thelma was already a Griffin from her first marriage. She passed that name on to Peter. All of Peter's ancestors named Griffin would be from Thelma's side of the family, not Peter's father's side. However, this theory has a major problem. The show suggests that Francis and Thelma were together for most of Peter's life. There is no clear evidence that Thelma had a previous marriage to someone named Griffin. This theory requires adding information that the show has never confirmed. Theory 4. The show does not care about consistency. The most realistic explanation is simply that Family Guy does not care about continuity or consistency. The show is famous for ignoring its own established facts. Characters die and come back to life. Ages change. Backstories contradict each other. The writers create whatever jokes they want in the moment, without worrying about whether it fits with previous episodes. Peter's ancestors are probably just meant to be funny cutaway gags. The writers were not thinking about how these ancestors fit into Peter's actual family tree. They just wanted to make jokes about historical figures who looked like Peter. The fact that they all have the Griffin surname, even though Peter's real father is a McFinnigan, is probably just an oversight or something the writers did not care about. Angus Griffin's connection. One interesting detail supports the common ancestor theory. Angus Griffin is mentioned as one of Peter's ancestors. Angus supposedly helped invent the game of golf in Scotland. According to the Family Guy wiki, Angus Griffin has the same look as Mickey McFinnigan, Peter's true father. This is significant. Angus Griffin is specifically noted to look like Mickey, not just like Peter. If Angus Griffin looks like Mickey McFinnigan, then maybe Angus is actually a McFinnigan ancestor, not a Griffin ancestor. Or maybe Angus represents the point where the Griffin and McFinnigan family lines were still connected before they split. The fact that Angus has the Griffin name but the McFinnigan appearance suggests that the two families were somehow mixed together in the past. This lends credibility to the idea that Griffins and McFinnigans share common ancestry. What this means for Peter's identity. The revelation about Mickey McFinnigan raises important questions about Peter's identity. Who is Peter Griffin really? Is he a Griffin at all? Or is he actually Peter McFinnigan? Legally and socially, Peter is still a Griffin. That is the name he was raised with. That is the name on all his official documents. That is how everyone knows him. Peter Griffin is his identity, regardless of his biological parentage. But genetically, Peter is a McFinnigan. He has Mickey's DNA. He has Mickey's appearance. He has Mickey's personality traits. Peter's love of drinking, his irresponsibility, his happy-go-lucky attitude, his slovenly ways, all of these come from Mickey, not from Francis. Peter inherited everything important from his biological father. Peter also has qualities from his mother, Thelma. But Francis, the man who raised him, contributed almost nothing to who Peter is. Francis was stern, religious, and harsh. Peter is the opposite in almost every way. The only thing Peter got from Francis was the experience of being raised by someone who constantly criticized him. The significance of the drinking contest. The drinking contest between Peter and Mickey is symbolically important. It proves that Peter and Mickey are connected. The ability to drink massive amounts of alcohol runs in the McFinnigan family. It is genetic. Peter has always been a heavy drinker. Now he knows where that trait comes from. But the drinking contest also proves something else. Peter can match his biological father in the one area that defines Mickey's identity. Mickey is the town drunk. Drinking is his claim to fame. It is what the townspeople respect him for. When Peter beats Mickey in the drinking contest, Peter proves he belongs to the McFinnigan line. He has the right genes. He is one of them. Francis's last words take on new meaning in this context. Peter, you're a fat, stinkin' drunk. Francis spent his final breath criticizing Peter for the same quality that would later prove Peter's true parentage. Peter is a drunk because he is Mickey's son. Francis was essentially acknowledging the truth about Peter's paternity without realizing it. Mickey and O'Brien as mirror images. Another interesting detail is that Mickey has a talking sheep named O'Brien. This sheep is obviously a parallel to Peter's talking dog Brian. The sheep acts similar to Brian. It has similar mannerisms. It is essentially the Irish version of Brian. This suggests that Peter's relationship with Brian is also something he inherited from Mickey. Mickey surrounds himself with a talking animal companion. Peter does the same. Like father, like son, even Peter's choice of best friend reflects his biological father's influence. The name O'Brien is clearly a play on Brian, the Irish version of Brian's name. This is the show's way of showing that Peter's entire life, including his best friend, mirrors Mickey's life in Ireland. Peter grew up to become just like his biological father, even though he never met Mickey until he was 43 years old. Why the truth remained hidden. One question remains. Why did Thelma keep the truth about Peter's father hidden for so long? Why did she let Francis raise Peter as his own son without ever telling either of them the truth? The most likely explanation is shame and social pressure. Thelma had an affair while she was married to or involved with Francis. She got pregnant from a one-night stand with an Irish man she barely knew. In a conservative Catholic family like the Griffins, this would be scandalous. Admitting the truth would have destroyed her marriage and her reputation. So Thelma lied. She let Francis believe Peter was his biological son. She raised Peter with that lie. Francis seemed to know the truth on some level. He told young Peter, "I'm not your father," multiple times. But perhaps Francis was in denial, or perhaps he and Thelma had an understanding that they would never speak the truth aloud. When Francis died, the secret could finally come out. Thelma could finally tell Peter about Mickey. There was no longer any reason to hide the truth. Francis was gone. The marriage was over. Thelma could free herself and Peter from the lie she had been living for over 40 years. The mystery continues. The question of Peter's ancestors and their Griffin surname remains unsolved. The show has never fully explained this mystery. Different fans have different theories. Some think the ancestors are made up. Some think the Griffins and McFinnegans share common ancestry. Some think the writers just did not care about consistency. What we know for certain is this. Peter Griffin's biological father is Mickey McFinnegan, an Irish drunk who lives in a small village in Ireland. Peter inherited his love of drinking, his personality, and his physical appearance from Mickey. But Peter was raised as a Griffin, and that name has stuck with him his entire life. Whether Peter is truly a Griffin by blood, or whether he should be a McFinnegan, or whether his ancestors are real or imagined, these questions remain open. Family Guy is not the kind of show that provides clear answers to mysteries like this. The confusion is part of the joke. The inconsistency is intentional, or at least accepted. Peter's true paternity is established fact, but the implications of that fact for his family history remain wonderfully, frustratingly unclear. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the Nate Griffin Connection, Peter's African Ancestry. The Nate Griffin Connection, Peter's African Ancestry. Peter Griffin always believed he was just an Irish-American guy from Rhode Island. He knew about his Irish roots through his stepfather Francis and his biological father Mickey McFinnegan. But Peter had no idea that his family tree included another branch entirely, a branch that would connect him to a completely different heritage. A heritage that would link him directly to his wife Lois in the most unexpected way possible. The truth about Peter's African ancestry came to light in one of the most shocking family revelations in the entire series. Peter discovered he had a black ancestor, not just any black ancestor, but a slave who had been owned by Lois's own family centuries ago. This discovery would change how Peter saw himself and raise serious questions about his relationship with Lois and their children. Chris starts talking different. The story begins with Peter's son Chris. Chris was on the high school basketball team. He started spending a lot of time with the black players on his team. They became friends. They hung out together. Chris picked up their way of talking. He started using street slang. His vocabulary changed completely. He spoke like the kids from the inner city, instead of like a typical suburban white teenager. Peter noticed this change immediately. At first, Peter was confused. He did not understand what Chris was saying half the time. Chris would use words and phrases that Peter had never heard before. When Chris came home talking this way, Peter's first reaction was to think something supernatural was happening. Peter actually believed Chris was speaking in tongues like in religious stories. He thought his son was possessed or having some kind of spiritual experience. Peter even tried to perform an exorcism on Chris. He went through the whole ritual, trying to drive out whatever force was making Chris talk differently. Of course, this did not work because Chris was not possessed. He was just copying his friends. Cleveland's suggestion. Peter's friend Cleveland Brown noticed what was happening with Chris. Cleveland understood the situation better than Peter did. He recognized that Chris was simply adapting the speech patterns of his black friends. This was not unusual. Kids often pick up the way their peers talk, but Cleveland saw this as an opportunity. Cleveland suggested to Peter that maybe Chris was connecting with some black heritage. Maybe there was a reason Chris felt comfortable with this way of speaking. Cleveland told Peter that perhaps Chris was trying to connect with his Irish ancestry, or maybe there was something else in the family background. This got Peter thinking. Peter decided to take Chris to the Museum of Irish Heritage to help him connect with his roots. Peter thought this would solve the problem. If Chris learned about his Irish heritage, maybe he would stop talking like his black friends and start talking like a normal Irish-American kid again. But the trip to the museum did not go as planned. Peter and Chris did not find what they were looking for there. The Irish heritage connection did not explain Chris's behavior, so Peter decided to dig deeper. He decided to research the entire Griffin family history to understand where his family really came from. The discovery at the library. Peter went to the Quahog Public Library. He headed straight for the genealogical section. This was where they kept records of family histories. Peter wanted to trace the Griffin family line all the way back. He wanted to see every ancestor. He wanted to understand his complete heritage. Peter found old books about the Griffin family. He started reading through the records. At first, everything looked normal. He saw the ancestors he expected to see. Irish names, Irish faces, the typical Griffin family members going back generations. Then Peter found something shocking. There was a name in the Griffin family tree that did not fit the pattern, Nathaniel Griffin, or as he was called, Nate Griffin. According to the records, Nate Griffin was Peter's great-great-great-great-grandfather, and Nate Griffin was black. He was an African slave who had lived in America centuries ago. Peter could not believe what he was reading. He had a black ancestor. This meant Peter himself had African heritage. Peter was not just Irish American, he was also part African American. This completely changed how Peter saw his own identity. The Pewter-Schmidt connection. But the discovery got even more shocking. Peter kept reading through the records. He wanted to know more about Nate Griffin. Where had he lived? Who had owned him as a slave? What happened to him? Peter found the answer in a book about the Pewter-Schmidt family history. The Pewter-Schmidt family was Lois's family. They were wealthy. They had been wealthy for generations. And, according to the historical records, the Pewter-Schmidt family had owned slaves in the past. One of those slaves was Nate Griffin. Peter's black ancestor had been enslaved by Lois's white ancestors. The Pewter-Schmidt family had owned Peter's great-great-great-great-grandfather. This created a strange and uncomfortable connection between Peter and Lois that neither of them had known about. Peter was married to a woman whose family had enslaved his own ancestor. Their families had been connected for centuries, but not in a good way. The relationship had been one of master and slave, oppressor and oppressed. Now, generations later, Peter and Lois were married and had children together. Confronting Carter. Peter immediately went to confront his father-in-law, Carter Pewter-Schmidt. Carter was Lois's father and one of the wealthiest men in Rhode Island. He was also the descendant of the same family that had owned Nate Griffin as a slave. Peter demanded that Carter acknowledge what his family had done. Peter wanted Carter to take responsibility for the fact that the Pewter-Schmidt family had profited from slavery. Peter insisted that Carter owed him something. After all, the Pewter-Schmidt wealth had been built in part on the labor of enslaved people like Nate Griffin. Carter did not want to deal with this situation. He tried to brush Peter off. He tried to act like it was ancient history that did not matter anymore. But Peter would not let it go. Peter kept pushing. He kept demanding that Carter make things right. Finally, Carter decided the easiest solution was to pay Peter off. He wanted Peter to go away and never mention this again. Carter offered Peter money. He called it reparations for what the Pewter-Schmidt family had done to the Griffin family. Carter gave Peter $20,000 with one condition. Peter had to promise never to bring up the subject of Nate Griffin or slavery again. Peter eagerly took the money. $20,000 was a fortune to Peter. He could not believe Carter was just handing him this much cash. Peter agreed to Carter's terms. He promised to never mention the slavery connection again. Then Peter took the money and left. Misusing the money, Peter had $20,000. This was more money than Peter had ever had at one time. He could have used this money wisely. He could have invested it. He could have saved it for his children's education. He could have paid off debts. He could have done something responsible and meaningful with this money that represented his ancestors' suffering. Instead, Peter did something completely ridiculous. He used all $20,000 to recreate the set of Pee-wee's Playhouse in his living room. Pee-wee's Playhouse was a children's television show from the 1980 seconds. It had a colorful, wacky set with all kinds of strange furniture and talking objects. Peter rebuilt this entire set in his own home. He turned his living room into an exact replica of Pee-wee's Playhouse. He even convinced Brian to dress up as Jambi the Genie, one of the characters from the show. Peter would sit in his Pee-wee's Playhouse living room and act out scenes from the show. Lois was furious when she saw what Peter had done. This money was supposed to be compensation for slavery. It was supposed to honor Nate Griffin's memory and acknowledge the suffering of enslaved people. Instead, Peter had turned it into a joke. He had wasted it on a silly recreation of a kids' TV show. Rejection from both communities. Word got out about what Peter had done with the reparations money. The black community in Quahog heard that Peter had a black ancestor. At first, they welcomed Peter. They invited him to join them. They treated him as one of their own because of his African heritage through Nate Griffin. But when they found out Peter had used the reparations money to build Pee-wee's Playhouse, they were disgusted. They felt Peter had disrespected his black heritage. He had taken money meant to honor his enslaved ancestor and used it for something completely frivolous. The black community rejected Peter. They told him he was not welcome among them anymore. At the same time, the white community also rejected Peter. White people in Quahog found out that Peter had black ancestry. Some of them did not want to associate with Peter anymore because of this. They saw him differently now. He was no longer just one of them. He had become something other, something they did not fully accept. Peter found himself caught between two worlds. The black community did not want him because of how he had acted. The white community did not want him because of who he was. Peter was alone, rejected by both sides, all because of the revelation about Nate Griffin. Nate's ghost appears. One day, Peter was sitting in a bathroom, feeling sorry for himself. He was thinking about everything that had happened. The discovery of Nate Griffin, the reparations money, the rejection from both communities. Peter did not know what to do. He did not know how to fix the mess he had created. Suddenly, Nate Griffin's ghost appeared to Peter. Nate's spirit came to talk to his descendant. Nate looked at Peter with understanding and compassion. He was not angry at Peter. He was not upset about the Pee-wee's Playhouse incident. Instead, Nate wanted to help Peter make things right. Nate told Peter to do what was right with the money. Nate encouraged Peter to think about others instead of himself. Nate suggested that Peter should use whatever money was left to help people, to do something good, to honor the struggle that Nate and other enslaved people had endured. Peter listened to Nate's ghost. He realized he had been selfish and foolish. Peter decided to make amends. He went to a basketball game where both the black and white communities had gathered. Peter stood up in front of everyone. He announced that he had made a mistake. He said he would share the reparations money with his black brothers and sisters who deserved it more than he did. Peter threw the remaining money onto the basketball court. He told everyone that this money belonged to the black community. They should have it as compensation for slavery and its lasting effects. When both black and white people started grabbing for the cash, Peter clarified that he meant the money only for his black brothers. This gesture helped Peter begin to repair his relationship with the black community. The expanded story, untitled Griffin Family History. The full story of Nate Griffin was told in another episode called Untitled Griffin Family History. In this episode, the Griffin family was trapped in a panic room in their house because burglars had broken in. To pass the time, Peter decided to tell his family about their ancestors. One of the stories he told was the complete history of Nate Griffin. According to Peter's story, Nate Griffin's real name was not actually Nate Griffin. His birth name was Richard Bachman. He was born in Africa, in a place Peter called Quahogswana. Like many Africans during the slave trade, Nate was captured and brought to America on a slave ship. During the voyage across the ocean, Nate showed his clever and rebellious spirit. He played pranks on the slave ship captain. In one prank, Nate cut the floor around the captain's bed while he was sleeping. The bed floated out into the ocean. When the captain woke up and got out of bed, he fell straight into the water. This showed that even in the worst circumstances, Nate kept his sense of humor and his will to resist. Nate and the Pewter-Schmidt plantation. When Nate arrived in America, he was sold to the Pewter-Schmidt family. He became their slave. He worked on their plantation in the South. His job was to be the stable boy, taking care of the horses. But Nate found small ways to get revenge on his masters. Every day, Nate would pee in the Pewter-Schmidt family's cereal. They never knew. They would eat their breakfast every morning with Nate's urine mixed in, completely unaware. This was Nate's secret act of rebellion. It was his way of getting back at the people who owned him. But something else happened on the Pewterschmidt plantation, something that would change the Griffin and Pewterschmidt families forever. Nate fell in love. The object of his affection was Lois Laura Bush, Lynn Cheney, Pewterschmidt. She was the daughter of Silas Pewterschmidt, the plantation owner. She was white, he was black, and enslaved. Their love was forbidden. Despite the danger, Nate and Lois began a secret relationship. They spent time together in hiding. They fell deeply in love. Eventually, they started a family together. Lois became pregnant. She had children with Nate. These children were kept secret from Silas and the rest of the Pewterschmidt family. The secret family. The children that Nate and Lois had together looked exactly like the modern Griffin children. In Peter's telling of the story, there were 3 kids. One looked like Meg, one looked like Chris, one looked like Stewie. They were all biracial children, with both black and white heritage. But they lived in secret, hidden away from the plantation owners, who would never have approved. This secret family lived in fear of discovery. If Silas found out that his daughter was having children with one of his slaves, the consequences would be terrible. Nate would certainly be killed. Lois might be disowned or worse. The children would be in danger. Everything had to remain hidden. But eventually, the secret came out. Silas Pewterschmidt discovered what his daughter had been doing. He found out about her relationship with Nate. He found out about the children. He was furious. He wanted to punish both of them. He wanted to destroy this family that violated everything he believed in. The escape to freedom. Nate and Lois knew they had to run. They gathered their children. With the help of Al Cowlings, a friend who appears to be a reference to O.J. Simpson's friend from real life, they made their escape. They fled the plantation in the middle of the night. They took a wagon and drove away as fast as they could. There was a chase scene similar to the famous O.J. Simpson slow-speed chase. The reference was clear. Nate and his family in a wagon, fleeing from the plantation, with Silas and others in pursuit. But unlike O.J. Simpson, Nate and his family made it to safety. They escaped to the north, to freedom. Once they were free, Nate had an idea for revenge. He wanted to get back at white people for everything they had done to black people through slavery. But Nate's revenge was not violent. It was frustrating and annoying instead. Nate decided to invent something that would irritate white people forever. Nate Griffin founded the Department of Motor Vehicles, the DMV, the place where everyone has to go to get their license and registration. The place famous for long lines, inefficient service, and endless frustration. According to Peter's story, Nate created the DMV specifically to get back at white people. It was his way of making sure they would always have something to complain about. The implications. Are Peter and Lois related? The story of Nate Griffin raises an uncomfortable question. If Nate Griffin was Peter's ancestor, and if Nate had children with Lois Laura Bush, Lynn Cheney, Pewterschmidt, who was Lois's ancestor, then are Peter and Lois related to each other? The answer is yes, technically. Peter and Lois are distant cousins. They share Nate Griffin as a common ancestor. Nate is Peter's great-great-great-great-grandfather through the Griffin line. Nate is also one of Lois's great-great-great-great-grandfathers through the Pewterschmidt line, because he fathered children with Lois Laura Bush, Lynn Cheney, Pewterschmidt. This means Peter and Lois have the same ancestor several generations back. Their families mixed together centuries ago when Nate and the original Lois had their secret family. Over the generations, Nate's descendants became whiter and whiter as they married white people. Eventually, the African heritage became almost invisible in Peter's appearance, but it was still there in his DNA. Similarly, Lois has a tiny bit of African heritage from those same ancestors. The biracial children that Nate and Lois Laura Bush, Lynn Cheney, Pewterschmidt had together eventually became part of the Pewterschmidt family line, so Lois has a small amount of black ancestry too, just like Peter does. The fact that Peter and Lois are distant cousins is rarely mentioned in the show. It is treated as a minor detail rather than a major issue. In the real world, being distant cousins would not prevent people from marrying. After so many generations, the genetic connection is minimal, but it does create an odd connection between the two families. Peter's African-American heritage. The revelation about Nate Griffin means Peter Griffin is technically part African-American. He has African ancestry through Nate. This is part of Peter's genetic heritage, even if it does not show in his appearance. Peter looks completely white. He has white skin. He has European features. No one would guess by looking at him that he has African ancestry. But genetics do not lie. Peter carries African DNA from Nate Griffin. This makes Peter part of the African American community, at least in terms of ancestry. Whether Peter should identify as part African American is a different question. Peter was not raised in the Black community. He did not grow up with African American culture. He has lived his entire life as a white man. The show treats Peter's African heritage as something surprising and comedic. Peter tries to join the Black community after learning about Nate. He acts like he suddenly understands Black culture just because he has one Black ancestor from centuries ago. But the Black community in Quahog sees through this. They recognize that Peter is still a white man with white privilege, regardless of his ancestry. The contradiction with Mickey McFinnigan. There is one major problem with the Nate Griffin story. It contradicts what the show later revealed about Peter's true father. We know that Francis Griffin was not Peter's biological father. Peter's real father is Mickey McFinnigan, an Irishman. This means Peter is not actually a Griffin by blood. He is a McFinnigan. If Peter is a McFinnigan and not a Griffin, then how can Nate Griffin be his ancestor? Nate has the Griffin surname. He was supposedly part of the Griffin family line. But if Peter is not really a Griffin, then the connection to Nate makes no sense. Some fans have suggested that the Griffin and McFinnigan families must share a common ancestor somewhere in the past. Maybe Nate Griffin was actually related to the McFinnigans too. Maybe the families branched off from the same line centuries ago. This would explain how Peter can have both Mickey McFinnigan as his father and Nate Griffin as his ancestor. Another possibility is that the show simply does not care about this contradiction. Family Guy is not known for maintaining perfect continuity. The writers create whatever stories they want without always checking if they fit with previous episodes. The Nate Griffin story might have been written before the writers decided that Peter's real father was Mickey McFinnigan, or they might have just ignored the contradiction because the stories were good. Nate's personality and legacy. In both episodes where he appears, Nate Griffin is portrayed as a nice guy with a good heart. Unlike Peter, who is often selfish and foolish, Nate is kind and wise. Even as a ghost, Nate does not hold grudges. He is not angry at the Pewterschmidt family for enslaving him. He is not mad at Peter for wasting the reparations money. Instead, Nate offers guidance. He helps Peter make better choices. He encourages Peter to do the right thing. Nate represents the best qualities that Peter sometimes shows, but often forgets. Nate is what Peter could be if he tried harder to be a good person. Nate's legacy lives on through Peter and his children. Meg, Chris, and Stewie all carry Nate Griffin's DNA. They all have African ancestry through their father's family line. This heritage is invisible in their appearance, but it is part of who they are. They are multiracial, even if no one realizes it by looking at them. What it all means. The Nate Griffin connection adds another layer to Peter's already complicated family history. Peter is Irish through Mickey McFinnigan. He is African American through Nate Griffin. He might also be Jewish through Moses Griffin, though that ancestor's legitimacy is questionable. Peter is a mixture of many different heritages that have all contributed to who he is. The story of Nate Griffin also connects Peter and Lois's families in a way they never expected. Their families were linked through slavery and forbidden love, through oppression and resistance, through suffering and survival. Now, generations later, Peter and Lois have continued that legacy by having children together. The same families that were once divided by slavery are now united through marriage and love. Nate Griffin's story is tragic and hopeful at the same time. Tragic because of the slavery and injustice he endured. Hopeful because he found love anyway. He created a family anyway. He survived and passed on his genes to future generations. Nate's legacy lives on in Peter Griffin and his children, a reminder that even in the darkest times, people find ways to love, resist, and endure. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the Petarded reality, Peter's intellectual disability. The Petarded reality, Peter's intellectual disability. Imagine thinking you're a genius because you won Trivial Pursuit, only to discover your wife rigged the entire game with preschool questions and you actually have the IQ of a potato. Welcome to the 19th of June, 2005, when Family Guy dropped the nuclear option on Peter Griffin's brain cells and gave us an episode so legendary that IGN would later crown it the single greatest Family Guy episode of all time. We're talking about Petarded, the episode that medically diagnosed the main character as intellectually disabled and somehow turned it into comedy gold that still sparks debates in the fandom 20 years later. This is not just another wacky Family Guy episode. This is the Rosetta Stone of Peter Griffin's entire existence. This is the episode that explains why a grown man can accidentally kill his stepfather, hospitalize his wife multiple times, endanger his children, destroy half of Quahog, and still walk around like everything's fine. Because, according to medical documentation, everything is not fine. Peter Griffin's brain is running on 3 brain cells, and they're all fighting for 3rd place. The setup: when your wife thinks you're too stupid to win fairly. Game night at the Griffin house started innocently enough. The neighbors gathered, Trivial Pursuit cards shuffled, regular suburban fun. Joe Swanson was there with Bonnie. Cleveland showed up. Quagmire probably made 17 inappropriate comments before they even started. Classic Spooner Street energy. Except Lois pulled a move straight out of the Marriages Built on Lies playbook and swapped Peter's cards with the preschool edition. Think about that for a second. Your wife loves you so much she's willing to rig a board game because she knows you're too cognitively challenged to compete with regular adults. That's either the sweetest or most devastating thing a spouse can do, and honestly, I'm still not sure which. Peter won, obviously. When your questions are, what color is a fire truck, and how many fingers do you have, even Peter Griffin can stumble into correct answers. But here's the thing: Peter didn't just win. Peter gloated. He strutted around his living room like he'd just solved cold fusion, talking down to everyone, acting like he'd proven his intellectual superiority over his neighbors. Brian watched this unfold with the patience of a dog who's been dealing with Peter's nonsense for years and finally snapped. Brian, unable to stomach Peter's ego inflation any longer, threw down the gauntlet. Take the MacArthur Fellows program test and prove you're actually a genius. For those who don't know, the MacArthur Fellows program gives grants to actual geniuses. We're talking people who cure diseases, advance quantum physics, write groundbreaking literature. These are the "we trust you so much, we're giving you $500,000 to do whatever" people. And Brian told Peter to apply for this grant. This is the dog equivalent of telling your friend to try out for the Olympics because he beat you at beer pong. Peter walked into that testing center with the confidence of a man who thinks he invented the question mark. He genuinely believed he was about to join the ranks of Nobel Prize winners and revolutionary thinkers. The delusion was so complete that he hired a bulldozer with a drunk driver to level half his house in celebration before he even got the results back. That's how certain he was. The drunk driver crashed through the Griffin house yelling, "Congratulations," while Meg watched her bedroom get demolished. This was Peter's victory lap for a test he hadn't even finished taking. The diagnosis: 70 IQ and a chart that ended careers. The results came back. Peter scored a 70. For context, that places him in the intellectually disabled category, just barely scraping under the threshold for what was then classified as mental retardation. The average IQ is around 100. Peter clocked in at 70, which meant his brain was operating approximately 30 points below standard human functionality. To put this in perspective, Peter Griffin is closer to meeting a potato than he is to meeting average intelligence. The doctor delivered the news using a chart that referenced Forrest Gump, showing different intelligence categories. Average at the top, then Peter's category. And then because Seth MacFarlane woke up and chose absolute violence that day, a category below Peter labeled creationists. The show managed to diagnose Peter as intellectually disabled and insult religious. Fundamentalists in the same visual gag. Efficiency at its finest. The professor from the Rhode Island State Office of Mental Health tried to explain the results delicately, telling Peter he was just over the line of mental retardation. Peter, in a moment of cognitive clarity that must have used all 70 IQ points simultaneously, corrected him. Don't you mean just under the line? The professor absolutely lost it, nearly screaming, "The day I'm corrected by a ret," before catching himself and apologizing. Even the medical professional couldn't handle being fact-checked by someone he'd just diagnosed as intellectually disabled. Brian's reaction was even better. He dipped into absolute savage territory, rubbing Peter's face in the fact that he was right about Peter not being a genius. "You know, Peter, I hate to say I told you so about not being a genius, but in your fucking face, fuckwad." Then immediately apologized because even Brian knew that was too far. But he said it. That moment lives rent-free in Family Guy history. The exploitation phase, when disability becomes a get-out-of-jail-free card. Initially, Peter spiraled. Depression set in. The weight of being cognitively challenged crushed him. He closed his eyes while driving, wishing it would all be over, and immediately hit Tom Tucker with his car. The news anchor emerged from the wreckage furious, ready to call the police, possibly sue for everything Peter owned. Then he saw who was driving. Peter Griffin, the intellectually disabled fellow. Tucker's entire demeanor changed. He just let him go. No charges, no consequences. Just acceptance that Peter's brain couldn't be held to normal standards. A light bulb flickered on in Peter's damaged brain. Actually, it probably took several minutes for the electrical signals to reach the conclusion, but eventually Peter realized he could weaponize his disability. What followed was a masterclass in consequences, or the complete lack thereof. Peter kicked open women's bathroom doors. He screamed "testicles" over restaurant loudspeakers. He started Bible fights in church. He literally announced his disability, and then immediately did whatever chaotic nonsense entered his mind. Every bad decision punctuated with the same excuse: brain broke, cannot be held accountable. The entire town of Quahog became Peter's consequence-free playground because nobody wanted to punish the disabled guy. He exploited his diagnosis like a corporate tax loophole, squeezing every advantage out of a medical condition that should have prompted sympathy and support, not a crime spree. Peter Griffin discovered that society's uncomfortable relationship with disability meant he could literally announce, "I'm retarded," and people would just back away. Let him do whatever. Avoid the awkwardness of confronting someone whose brain doesn't work right. In the DVD version, there was an entire deleted musical number called "Peter is Slow" that got cut from broadcast because censors did not appreciate the overuse of the R word dozens of times in under 2 minutes. The scene parodied the telephone hour from Bye Bye Birdie, with everyone in Quahog calling each other to spread the news about Peter's diagnosis like it was hot gossip. Joe calling Cleveland, Cleveland calling Mort, the whole town getting the update via musical telephone chain. Fox Broadcasting said absolutely not and axed it, but it lives on in DVD infamy. The episode also featured Timer, a character from 1970 Seconds Saturday Morning PSA cartoons about nutrition and time management. The producers wanted Lenny Weinrib, Timer's original voice actor, to reprise the role, but Weinrib was old, couldn't remember the character, and declined. He'd die just over a year later in 2006, making this one of the last attempts to bring back a piece of 70 Seconds Saturday Morning nostalgia before it was gone forever. Peter's intellectual disability episode accidentally became a time capsule for forgotten children's television. The Grease incident, when stupidity becomes genuinely dangerous. But here's where the theory gets dark and the show got real. Peter's disability wasn't just a source of crude humor and social commentary, it was actively dangerous. His worst moment came when he tried to steal a deep fryer from a fast food restaurant, not because he was evil, not because he wanted to hurt anyone, but because his 70 IQ brain thought free deep fryer sounded like a solid plan with zero consideration for consequences, logistics, or the basic physics of carrying a container full of scalding oil. He accidentally poured the entire thing over Lois, covering her in hot grease that sent her to the hospital with severe burns. While she recovered, smelling like French fries, Peter's actual observation, because even in tragedy he's thinking about food, the real consequences hit. Child Protective Services showed up in the form of Agent Jessup, took one look at Peter Griffin's medical records and recent behavior, and made an executive decision: this man is mentally unfit to parent. They took Meg, Chris, and Stewie away, just like that. The Griffin children were removed from their home because their father was clinically intellectually disabled and had just proven he couldn't be trusted not to literally set his wife on fire. Cleveland Brown became the temporary guardian because apparently Cleveland was the only neighbor qualified to raise children that week. Not Quagmire, for obvious reasons. Not Joe, probably too busy being a cop. Cleveland got the Griffin kids and immediately proved to be a better parent than Peter, which, given Cleveland's own track record, is saying something. The prostitute gambit, Peter's dumbest legal strategy ever. Peter, faced with losing his family forever, needed a strategy to get his kids back. A normal person might demonstrate improved parenting skills, might take classes, might work with social services to prove they could be responsible. Peter Griffin decided the best strategy was to prove Cleveland was worse by framing him for prostitution. Because when you're fighting to regain custody of your children, hiring 7 prostitutes and planting them in your friend's house is definitely the galaxy brain move. The plan was so stupid it actually requires breaking down. Peter hired 7 prostitutes. Peter brought them to Cleveland's house. Peter assumed this would make Cleveland look bad. Peter apparently forgot that Agent Jessup and the entire court system have functioning brains. The judge saw through this immediately. Agent Jessup saw through this immediately. Everyone with more than 70 IQ points saw through this immediately. Cleveland, displaying the patience of a saint, told Peter and 5 of the prostitutes to get out. He kept 2 because, well, Cleveland's going through some things, but at least he had the presence of mind to maintain plausible deniability. The courtroom scene delivered one of the most savage lines in Family Guy history. Agent Jessup stood up and announced that Peter had inspired him to distrust all mentally challenged parents. The judge thanked Agent Jessup for his comically misleading remarks and then proceeded to explain to Peter that being intellectually disabled was the least of his problems. The judge basically told Peter that beyond the medical diagnosis, beyond the low IQ, beyond all clinical explanations, Peter Griffin was also just a terrible person. Peter's heartfelt plea failed. His attempt to demonstrate parenting capability failed. His prostitute frame-up failed. He barely avoided prison. The Griffins were done. Peter and Brian sat at home, lamenting that their family would never be together again. The episode seemed headed for a genuinely dark ending where Peter's disability and terrible decision-making permanently destroyed his family. Then Lois walked through the door, fully recovered, custody reinstated, permanently smelling like McDonald's. Everything snapped back to normal because this is Family Guy and consequences are allergic to Peter Griffin. The status quo restored itself like a rubber band snapping back into place. Peter was overjoyed. The kids were home. Lois would smell like French fries for 6 months, but hey, small price to pay for family reunification. The cultural earthquake, why Petarded, changed everything. The episode ended with everything back to normal, but nothing was ever really normal again. Petarded achieved something remarkable. It became both the most celebrated and most controversial episode in Family Guy's history. It gained a Nielsen rating of 4.4, making it the 42nd most watched show the week it aired. Not bad for an episode that diagnosed its main character as intellectually disabled and then spent 22 minutes exploring every uncomfortable implication. In 2014, when IGN celebrated Family Guy's 15th anniversary, they published a list of the top 15 episodes. Petarded ranked number 1, the best Family Guy episode of all time, according to one of the internet's largest entertainment publications. Their reasoning: the show is at its comedic best with this episode, with musical numbers and family drama to back up the offensive humor. Translation: Family Guy figured out how to be offensive, emotionally resonant, and hilarious simultaneously. Francis Rizzo III of DVD Talk praised it as classic Family Guy material, specifically calling out the deleted musical montage and the appearance of the naked, greased-up deaf guy as proof that the creators still had that sense of the bizarre in them. The Sydney Morning Herald called it a real thigh slapper. Critics either loved it for pushing boundaries or were deeply uncomfortable with the entire premise. There was no middle ground. The episode was so culturally significant that it inspired an entire academic book, Family Guy and Philosophy. A Cure for the Petarded, a collection of 17 essays exploring connections between the series and historical philosophers. Scholars literally wrote philosophical treatises about Peter Griffin's intellectual disability. The episode became a case study in how animated comedy could tackle sensitive subjects and generate genuine academic discourse. The theory, how 70 IQ explains literally everything. The Petarded diagnosis is not just a one-off gag. The fandom latched onto this episode because it retroactively explained everything. Every awful decision Peter makes throughout the series suddenly has a clinical foundation. Every time he destroys property, endangers lives, or makes choices that would get a normal person arrested, there's now an official, medically documented reason. Peter's IQ of 70 explains his social immunity. Quahog residents constantly let him slide because they're aware he's cognitively impaired. Tom Tucker forgave vehicular assault. The town tolerates his chaos. Even Lois stays married to him despite the grease burns, the near-death experiences, and the general life-threatening incompetence. She knows what she signed up for, medically speaking. Their entire marriage is built on Lois's acceptance that Peter's brain simply doesn't work like other people's brains. The diagnosis also explains his impulsiveness and complete lack of foresight. Peter lives in a permanent state of seemed like a good idea at the time because his brain physically cannot process long-term consequences. He hired a drunk bulldozer driver to demolish half his house in celebration of test results he hadn't even read yet. That's not just stupid, that's neurologically consistent with his diagnosis. His brain lacks the executive function to connect actions with future outcomes. Here's where the theory gets meta. Peter might have brain damage in Wernicke's area, which would explain his random cutaway gags. This theory comes from Wikipedia's character analysis, noting that Peter cuts away into seemingly random situations and speaks in perfect grammar, but cannot seem to choose how to create a sentence. Wernicke's area handles language comprehension and sentence formation. If Peter's brain is damaged there, it would explain why his thoughts jump tracks like a derailed train made of poorly connected neurons. Every cutaway gag might be Peter's damaged brain misfiring in real time. When he suddenly flashes back to that time he worked at a brewery with a disabled colleague, or remembers being a contestant on a game show, or recalls fighting a giant chicken, those might not be actual memories. They might be Peter's brain frantically trying to make connections and failing, generating random scenarios that his damaged Wernicke's area stitches together with whatever vocabulary happens to be firing at that moment. The fandom debates whether Peter is truly intellectually disabled or just spectacularly dumb. Some argue it's just a joke, not meant to be taken seriously. Others point out that the show explicitly confirmed it through medical testing, but the episode made it canon. The score is official. The diagnosis is documented. Peter Griffin's IQ is 70, placing him just barely below the threshold for intellectual disability. Whether you believe it explains his behavior or just adds another layer to the chaos, Petarded gave us medical proof that Peter Griffin's brain is running on firmware from 1987, and nobody bothered to install updates. The character shift, from bumbling dad to psychopathic man-child. The episode also marks a shift in Peter's character arc. Before Petarded, he was a bumbling dad with a good heart. Dumb, sure. Reckless, absolutely. But ultimately well-meaning. After the diagnosis, the show leaned harder into his psychopathic man-child tendencies. The writers had justification now. They could push Peter further because they'd established clinical precedent. He's not malicious, he's just operating with the intellectual capacity of someone who thinks World War V would skip over World Wars III and IV because it would be so intense. That's a real line from another episode where Peter's lack of understanding basic chronology becomes a plot point. His disability gives the writers permission to make him progressively more absurd without breaking character consistency. And yet, Peter occasionally displays moments of emotional intelligence that his IQ score shouldn't allow. He supports his family, he shows creativity and leadership. He navigates crises with street smarts that a 70 IQ wouldn't typically enable. In Back to the Woods, he outsmarts James Woods using the exact same trick twice, then makes a meta comment that they should just start with that strategy next time. That's forward thinking. That's pattern recognition and strategic planning. Which raises another layer to the theory. Maybe Peter's disability is specific. Maybe he's intellectually impaired in traditional metrics, the kind tested by standardized IQ exams, but compensates with other forms of intelligence that tests don't measure. Emotional intelligence, social manipulation, survival instincts. The kind of street smarts that help him navigate Quahog's chaos, despite having a double-digit IQ. Or maybe the writers just forget about his diagnosis when they need him to be competent for a plot. Family Guy is not exactly known for continuity. Characters die and come back. Timelines make no sense. The show operates on cartoon logic, where consistency takes a back seat to whatever's funny in the moment. But Petarded gave the fandom a framework to analyze every Peter Griffin decision through a medical lens, and they've been running with it ever since. The bottom line, Peter Griffin's brain is documented garbage. Either way, Petarded gave the Family Guy fandom the Rosetta Stone for understanding Peter Griffin. Every explosion, every lawsuit, every near-death experience can be traced back to the 19th of June, 2005, when a simple IQ test revealed that the man leading the Griffin family has the cognitive capacity of someone who thinks disabilities are contagious and calls ex-girlfriends to warn them to get tested. The episode ended with everything back to normal, but nothing was ever really normal again. Peter Griffin was officially, medically, canonically, intellectually disabled. His IQ of 70 became permanent character canon that the show could reference, ignore, or exploit, depending on what the joke required. And Quahog has been dealing with the consequences, or complete lack thereof, ever since. The theory holds up because the show made it official. This is not fan speculation. This is not reading too much into subtext. Peter Griffin took a legitimate IQ test, scored a 70, and was diagnosed as intellectually disabled by the Rhode Island State Office of Mental Health. Everything that follows, every disaster, every injury, every moment of chaos, can be traced back to that diagnosis. So the next time Peter does something catastrophically stupid, remember, there's a medical chart somewhere with his name on it, sitting right above creationists and right below average. That's not a theory, that's canon, that's Petarded. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Peter's multiple deaths and his bond with death. Peter's multiple deaths and his bond with death. Let me paint you a picture. You're a supernatural entity tasked with collecting souls for all eternity. And one particular fat guy in Rhode Island keeps dying and coming back like a boomerang with a drinking problem. At some point, you stop trying to fight it and just become friends with him. Welcome to Death's relationship with Peter Griffin, the most bizarre friendship in animated television history, and possibly the only reason Peter's still breathing after decades of monumentally stupid decisions. Peter Griffin has died more times than a video game character with infinite lives. We're talking cutaway gags, where he shoots himself out of boredom. Episodes where he gets hit by cars. Moments where he accidentally kills himself trying to prove a point. Plane crashes, suicide attempts that are played for laughs, car accidents. The list goes on like a CVS receipt of mortality. And yet, every single time, Peter walks away. Reset button pressed, status quo restored, family intact. The fandom has been asking the same question for years. How does Peter keep dodging permanent death when other characters get killed off for good? Francis Griffin stayed dead after Peter crushed him with a unicycle. Mr. Weed choked on a dinner roll and never came back. Loretta Brown got crushed by a falling bathtub, and that was it. Permanent death, no resurrection. Cleveland moved on. But Peter can die 50 times in cutaways alone and show up for dinner like nothing happened. The theory goes like this. Death considers Peter a friend and actively spares him from permanent death. It sounds ridiculous until you look at the evidence, and then it becomes the most logical explanation for Peter's supernatural immunity to consequences. The first meeting. Death is a bitch. The friendship started in Season 2, Episode 6, titled Death is a Bitch, which aired the 21st of March 2000. This is patient zero for the Peter-Death relationship, and it sets up everything that follows. Peter finds a lump on his chest turns out to be a benign fatty corpuscle, which Peter confuses with fatty arbuckle because his brain works in mysterious ways. The doctor gives him a clean bill of health, But Peter sees the hospital bill and decides he'd rather be dead than pay it. So Peter does what any intellectually disabled man with poor impulse control would do. He declares himself deceased on the insurance form. Not thinking this through, not considering consequences, just writing deceased where it says name and no thanks, I'm dead, where it says sex. Classic Peter logic. Death shows up at the Griffin house to collect him. This version of Death was voiced by Norm Macdonald, who absolutely killed it with the role. Adam Carolla would later take over the voice, and while good, Norm's sarcastic delivery made Death iconic. Death appears as a skeletal figure in a black robe, and under his hood is a human skull with spiders and snakes crawling through the eye sockets, mouth, and ear cavities. Nightmare fuel, wrapped in dark comedy. Peter sees Death coming and does what Peter does best, runs away. Death chases him, and here's where everything changes. Death falls down and sprains his ankle. This supernatural entity, responsible for collecting every human soul on Earth, trips while chasing Peter Griffin and injures himself badly enough that he can't do his job. Death ends up staying at the Griffin house to recover, wearing a Providence College hooded sweatshirt that the family loans him because even the Grim Reaper needs athleisure wear when he's off duty. While Death heals, no one can die, anywhere. The laws of mortality have been suspended because Peter Griffin caused Death to sprain his ankle. The episode features one of the most memorable moments in Family Guy history. Death sitting on the Griffin's couch playing the board game Life with Lois while waiting for his ankle to heal. Death literally says, "I know I should find this ironic, but really, I'm just bored as hell." The Grim Reaper is playing a game about human existence while unable to perform his actual job, and he's just annoyed about it. Peter, being Peter, tells everyone that nobody can die. He proves it by getting shot in the head by news reporter Trisha Takanawa and surviving. The whole world discovers Death has been suspended. People go wild. Tom Tucker pulls out a chainsaw on live television because consequences don't exist anymore. It becomes international news that the laws of death no longer apply. Death realizes he needs to fix this situation, so he makes Peter his temporary replacement. Death gives Peter his cloak and scythe and sends him out to kill someone high profile enough to prove that Death still exists. Death's suggestion? Kill the kids from Dawson's Creek. Peter actually says, "I knew it. As soon as that show came on the air, I said, I'm gonna be the one who has to kill these kids." Lois confirms this is true. Peter boards a plane with the Dawson's Creek cast, fully intending to kill them, but can't go through with it when he sees innocent passengers would be affected. Instead, he accidentally opens the plane door mid-flight, sucking out and killing the two pilots, which proves people can still die. Actress Karen Black has to land the plane like in Airport 1975, and Tom Tucker calls it an obscure reference because Family Guy loves being meta. Death's ankle heals. The natural order is restored. And here's the critical moment. Death leaves Peter be for the time being. Not, "I'm coming back for you." Not, "Your time will come." Death leaves him be. Satisfied that Peter restored mortality, Death just moves on. No consequences for Peter. No punishment for causing this whole mess. Death walked away. The friendship develops. Death lives. Fast forward to Season 3, Episode 9, Death Lives, which aired the 15th of August 2001. This is where the friendship solidifies. Peter dies again. The episode doesn't even bother explaining how, because at this point Peter dying is just a Tuesday, and Death shows up to collect him. But instead of taking Peter immediately, Death asks for a favor. Death wants Peter to help him get a date with Amy, a woman who works at a pet store. Death is lonely, socially awkward, and terrible with women, likely because he has a habit of accidentally killing girls he's with, as shown in disturbing flashbacks. Peter agrees to help, because apparently when you've helped Death restore the natural order of mortality, you become his wingman. They go on a double date. Peter and Lois, Death and Amy. It goes terribly. Amy's views on animals turn out to be irritating and boring to Death, so he touches her. She dies instantly, spilling her coffee as Death calls for the check. Death murdered his date out of annoyance, and Peter just watched it happen. No consequences, just another Tuesday. But here's the important part. Death helps Peter in return. Peter's marriage to Lois is falling apart, and Death shows Peter glimpses of what his life was like before Lois. Death uses his supernatural powers to help Peter remember why he loves his wife, effectively becoming Peter's marriage counselor. Death is using his cosmic abilities to save Peter's relationship. During their adventures, Peter pulls down Death's hood, revealing the skull with snakes and bugs crawling all over it. Most people would run screaming. Peter just keeps going. They're past the point of formality. They're friends now. Meet the Quagmires. Death becomes Peter's time travel buddy. The friendship reaches peak absurdity in Meet the Quagmires, Season 5, Episode 18. Death shows up at the Drunken Clam to check on Horace, the bartender, who fell off a ladder. Peter, bored with his life, convinces Death to let him travel back in time to 1984 to see what his life would have been like if he'd made different choices. Death agrees. Death, the literal embodiment of mortality, responsible for collecting billions of souls, becomes Peter's time travel accomplice. Because Peter asked nicely, they travel back to the 80 seconds multiple times. Peter lives out bachelor fantasies. Peter almost destroys his marriage with Lois. Death just hangs out, facilitating this chaos, helping Peter navigate alternate timelines like they're buddies on a road trip. This is insane. Death should not be doing this. Death should be collecting souls, maintaining the natural order, doing literally anything other than enabling Peter Griffin's midlife crisis via temporal manipulation. But Death does it anyway because they're friends. Friends of Peter G. Death saves Peter's life again. In Season 9, Episode 17, Friends of Peter G., Peter dies in a car crash after driving home drunk. Death appears, and instead of taking Peter to the afterlife, Death shows him what his life would be like without alcohol, and what it would be like if he continues drinking as much as he does. Death is giving Peter a second chance. Death is using his powers to teach Peter about responsible drinking. Death literally tells Peter to drink responsibly, and sends him back to life. Death resurrected Peter, and gave him a moral lesson about alcoholism. This is not normal Grim Reaper behavior. Death should be neutral. Death should collect souls without bias. But Death actively saved Peter's life and gave him advice on how to live better. That's not the job description, that's what friends do. The oddity. Death can't kill Peter. Here's where it gets weird. Whenever Death touches someone, they die instantly. That's canon. Multiple episodes establish this. In I Take Thee Quagmire, a woman touches Death's wrist and dies immediately. A man gives Death a high five and drops dead. Direct contact with Death equals instant death. Except for Peter. Death has touched Peter multiple times throughout the series with no harmful effects. In Death is a Bitch, Death physically interacts with Peter constantly. They're in the same house for days. In Death Lives, Death is right next to Peter, pulling him into visions of the past. In Meet the Quagmires, they're traveling through time together. Physical contact happens repeatedly. Peter never dies from it. The show even acknowledges this oddity in the Family Guy wiki, noting that whenever Death touches someone, they usually die, but he has touched Peter multiple times with no harmful effects. The show's own internal logic confirms that Death's touch doesn't work on Peter Griffin. Why? The theory is simple. Death considers Peter a friend and has made him immune. Death has the power to kill with a touch, which means Death has the power to choose not to kill with a touch. And Death chooses not to kill Peter over and over again, across multiple encounters, multiple timelines, multiple deaths, and resurrections. Grumpy Old Man, even Death's death doesn't stick. In Grumpy Old Man, Season 10, Episode 9, Carter Pewterschmidt causes a traffic accident that kills Death himself. Super Death shows up a larger, more powerful version of Death to oversee Death's transition. Super Death tells Death he's being reincarnated as a Chinese baby girl. Death disappears, immediately reappears as a newborn, and then just comes back as regular. Death shortly after. Even Death dying doesn't stick in this universe. But the important detail, Peter's not involved in this death. Carter caused it. And yet Death comes back anyway, ready to continue his duties, which include repeatedly sparing Peter Griffin from permanent death. The evidence keeps piling up. Peter has died in so many cutaway gags that fans have lost count. He's shot himself out of boredom over stamp collecting. He's shot himself rather than attend Quagmire's show. He's jumped off buildings. He's been in plane crashes. He's accidentally killed himself, trying to prove points. In one episode, Peter boards a tour bus and shoots himself in the head. There's a flash of light in the window, showing him blowing his brains out, and by the next episode, he's fine. Meanwhile, permanent deaths happen to other characters all the time. Thelma Griffin died of a stroke and stayed dead. Brian died when hit by a car, though Stewie brought him back via time travel. Angela died swimming too soon after eating. Mayor Adam West died and stayed dead. Horace got hit by a baseball and died permanently. Muriel Goldman got stabbed by Diane Simmons and stayed dead. But Peter can die in cutaways, die in episodes, die for gags, die to prove points, and every single time he comes back. No explanation, no consequences. Just back to normal like death is a minor inconvenience. The only logical explanation is that death has placed Peter under some kind of protection. They've been through too much together. Death owes Peter for restoring the natural order in Death is a Bitch. Peter helped Death try to find love in Death Lives. They've time traveled together. They've hung out at the Griffin house. Death wore Peter's family's clothes. They've shared beers. Death can use his eye socket as a bottle opener, which is both impressive and disturbing. Death and Peter Griffin are friends, and when you're friends with Death, apparently death becomes optional. The meta joke, Peter's immunity, breaks the fourth wall. Family Guy is aware of this. The show acknowledges that Peter dies constantly without consequences. In Life of Brian, when Brian dies and stays dead for multiple episodes, fans went absolutely insane because death actually stuck for once. Petitions were launched. Social media exploded. The news media covered it like a real death. Then Stewie brought Brian back via time travel and everything returned to normal. But the fact that Brian's death caused such outrage proves that audiences expect Family Guy deaths to be temporary, especially for main characters. The show has trained viewers to expect resurrection, to expect the reset button, to expect that no matter what happens, Peter and the core cast will be fine. But only Peter has the death friendship to explain it. Brian needed time travel. Stewie needed technology. Peter just needs death to look the other way, which death does, every single time, because they're buddies. The bottom line, death's best friend. The theory holds up because the evidence is overwhelming. Peter Griffin has died dozens, possibly hundreds of times across cutaway gags and episodes. Other characters die and stay dead. But Peter always comes back because death considers him a friend and actively chooses to spare him. They've lived together. They've helped each other with relationships. They've time traveled together. Death has resurrected Peter, given him life advice, and made him immune to the touch of death itself. This is not standard Grim Reaper protocol, this is friendship. So the next time Peter dies in a cutaway gag, remember, somewhere in the Family Guy universe, death is watching, seeing the notification that Peter Griffin's time has come, and just sighing like, not this guy again, before filing Peter's death certificate in the ignore folder and going back to collecting souls from people he doesn't owe favors to. Peter Griffin is immortal because death likes him. That's it, that's the theory. And in a show where a baby builds time machines and a dog writes novels, this might actually be the most logical explanation Family Guy has ever offered. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Peter's deteriorating brain theory. Peter's deteriorating brain theory. Picture this. Season 1, Peter Griffin could hold down a job, have meaningful conversations, and occasionally display genuine intelligence. Now picture Season 22 Peter Griffin trying to count to 3 and genuinely struggling. Something happened between these two versions of the same man, and the fandom has a theory that explains the transformation perfectly. Peter's brain is literally destroying itself through decades of accumulated trauma, and we've been watching it happen in real time. This is not subtle character evolution, this is documented neurological decline, masquerading as comedy, and once you see the pattern, you cannot unsee it. Peter Griffin used to be oafish but functional. A bumbling dad with good intentions who loved his family despite making terrible choices. Now he's near vegetative, operating on what appears to be 3 functioning brain cells that take turns being in charge. The theory says his constant injuries and repeated brain trauma are progressively destroying him, episode by episode, season by season, injury by catastrophic injury. Welcome to the darkest Peter Griffin theory in the fandom, the one that suggests Family Guy has been documenting a man's slow descent into permanent brain damage for over 2 decades, and nobody stopped to ask if maybe someone should check on him. The early years, when Peter had a brain. Let's establish the baseline. Early Peter Griffin seasons 1 through 3 was not a genius. Let's be clear about that. He was impulsive, he made dumb decisions, he prioritized beer and television over responsibility, but he functioned, he held down jobs, he had coherent conversations, he showed genuine love for his family, and, critically, he could learn from his mistakes. Season 1, Peter could read fairy tales to Stewie. He wrote erotic novels in Peterotica that became popular enough for Betty White to voice the audiobook. He displayed moments of actual intelligence, creativity, and emotional depth. Yes, he strangled the Easter Bunny and fought a giant chicken, but beneath the chaos was a recognizable human being with cognitive function. The show's own internal logic confirms this. In early seasons, Peter's stupidity was innocently insensitive behavior, the actions of an arrogant idiot who didn't quite understand what he was doing wrong but could eventually see the error of his ways. He was written as a conventional, bumbling dad. Dumb, sure. Reckless, absolutely. But fundamentally capable of growth. Then something shifted. Around season 4, and especially from season 8 onward, Peter transformed. His intelligence dropped from idiot to legally, mentally disabled. His well-meaning nature vanished, replaced by psychopathic man-child tendencies. He became completely apathetic to the misery he caused, and in some episodes, outright sadistic about it. This was not normal character development, this was Flanderization on steroids, and the fandom needed an explanation. The brain trauma theory provides that explanation. It suggests that every injury, every concussion, every moment of physical damage to Peter's head has been chipping away at his cognitive function. And when you start counting the injuries, the theory stops sounding like speculation and starts sounding like medical documentation. The stroke that changed everything. McStroke. Season 6, Episode 8, McStroke, aired the 13th of January, 2008. This episode is the smoking gun for the brain deterioration theory because it shows on screen, in explicit detail, Peter Griffin suffering catastrophic brain damage that should have killed him or left him permanently disabled. Peter eats over 30 hamburgers in one sitting at a fast food restaurant called McBurgertown. His body cannot process this much grease and sodium. His left eye starts twitching uncontrollably. Peter asks Brian if he's winking at him. Then Peter begins spazzing out, screaming, and collapses to the floor. Brain rushes to call an ambulance. Peter has had a stroke. Dr. Hartman delivers the diagnosis. Mrs. Griffin, your husband has had a stroke. The left half of his body is completely paralyzed. The left side of Peter's face droops grotesquely, his eye and part of his mouth hang over. His left arm becomes limp, useless. He can barely speak, his words slurred beyond recognition. Peter lives like this for 3 months. 3 months of walking with a limp, his arm and leg hanging lifelessly from his body, his face permanently disfigured. Then Peter gets cured at a stem cell research facility in 5 minutes, and everything returns to normal. The show treats this like a miracle. The fandom knows better. Strokes cause permanent brain damage. Massive strokes that paralyze half your body, destroy neural pathways that cannot fully regenerate, even with cutting-edge medical intervention. Peter's stroke may have been cured visually, but the neurological damage remained. From this point forward, Peter's intelligence nosedives. The theory suggests the stroke destroyed critical portions of his brain portions responsible for impulse control, decision-making, empathy, and higher-order thinking. Peter's brain never recovered. It just learned to compensate with what was left, which wasn't much. The IQ test confirmed intellectual disability. We already covered Petarded in a previous section, but it bears repeating here because it's critical to the brain deterioration timeline. Season 4, Episode 6, Peter takes an IQ test and scores a 70, officially placing him in the intellectually disabled category, just barely under the threshold for what was then called mental retardation. But here's the thing, the episode treats this like Peter was always this dumb. like the low IQ was a pre-existing condition that just happened to get documented. The brain trauma theory suggests otherwise. The theory posits that Peter's IQ has been declining progressively due to accumulated injuries, and Petarded just happened to be the moment when medical professionals finally measured it. Early, Peter could read books, write novels, hold conversations that required abstract thinking. By season 4, his IQ is 70, and by season 8, he legitimately cannot understand basic concepts. The deterioration is measurable and documented. Peter is not naturally this stupid. He became this stupid through repeated head trauma that destroyed his cognitive abilities, one injury at a time. The injury count, a medical horror show. Let's talk about the injuries. Watch Mojo literally made a list of Peter Griffin's funniest injuries, which sounds fun until you realize they're cataloging traumatic brain injuries that would kill a normal human being. Peter loses all the fingers on his right hand handling M80 firecrackers. The explosion happens directly in his face, meaning shockwave trauma to his skull. He gets hit with a full-sized bull spit at him by a student, which crushes him and destroys a classroom. The force required to crush a human being with livestock is enough to cause severe cranial damage. Peter gets in car accidents constantly. He's been hit by cars. He's crashed cars into buildings. He's fallen from significant heights. He's been crushed by falling objects. He's been beaten, strangled, shot, and subjected to explosions. Each of these incidents carries the potential for concussions, contusions, subdural hematomas, and permanent brain damage. And here's the kicker. Cartoon logic means Peter always recovers. The injuries vanish between scenes, but brains don't work that way. Traumatic brain injuries accumulate. Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE, develops from repeated concussions, even minor ones. NFL players develop it from decades of football. Peter Griffin has endured injuries that make NFL hits look like gentle pats, and he's been enduring them for over 20 years. The theory suggests that every injury added another layer of damage. Every explosion, every fall, every moment where Peter's head makes contact with a hard surface at high velocity, all of it contributed to the progressive destruction of his brain. The show plays it for laughs. The fandom sees the medical tragedy. Wernicke's area, the cutaway gag explanation. Wikipedia's character analysis notes something fascinating. Peter might have brain damage in Wernicke's area as he cuts away into seemingly random situations and speaks in perfect grammar, but cannot seem to choose how to create a sentence. Wernicke's area is the part of the brain responsible for language comprehension and sentence formation. Damage to Wernicke's area causes Wernicke's aphasia, a condition where people can speak fluently with correct grammar, but the words make no semantic sense. They cannot organize thoughts into coherent sentences even though the mechanical ability to speak remains intact. Peter's cutaway gags might not be comedy gold, they might be neurological misfiring. His brain, damaged from decades of trauma, randomly jumps to unrelated memories and scenarios because the neural pathways responsible for maintaining coherent thought have been destroyed. Every cutaway is Peter's damaged Wernicke's area, attempting to process information and failing spectacularly. This explains why Peter's cutaways became more frequent and more nonsensical as the series progressed. Season 1 cutaways were relevant, brief, and connected to the conversation. Modern cutaways are random, prolonged, and often completely disconnected from reality. That's not lazy writing, that's progressive brain damage, manifesting as increasingly severe cognitive dysfunction. The Flanderization effect, when brain damage looks like bad writing. The fandom uses the term Flanderization to describe what happened to Peter, the process where a character's personality trait gets exaggerated until it becomes their entire identity. Peter's stupidity was always there, but it consumed him. By season 8, stupidity was all he had left. The caring father vanished. The well-meaning idiot disappeared. What remained was a barely functional man-child operating on damaged neural tissue and cartoon physics. But Flanderization is a writing term. The brain deterioration theory reframes it as a medical term. Peter didn't get Flanderized, Peter got brain damaged. The writers simply documented the decline. His personality didn't change through bad writing. It changed because his frontal lobe, responsible for personality and impulse control, has been pulverized by 2 decades of catastrophic injuries. Critics and fans noticed the shift. They said Peter became much dumber, darker, psychopathic, and borderline disturbing to witness. One analysis stated his transformation was so severe that the audience genuinely questions his mental capacities. Another noted he went from a relatable, if somewhat exaggerated, figure to someone whose behavior veers into the psychotic. This is what severe brain trauma looks like: loss of empathy, inability to learn, violent mood swings, childish behavior, poor impulse control, inability to understand consequences. These are symptoms of traumatic brain injury, and Peter displays every single one with increasing severity as the seasons progress. Continuity errors as memory loss. The show has continuity problems. Peter claims in Coma Guy that he's never read a book in his life, except we've seen him read books before. He read fairy tales to Stewie. He read The Never-Ending Story in a cutaway. He wrote entire novels, but now he claims he's never read a book. The theory suggests this isn't a continuity error, it's memory loss from brain damage. Peter's hippocampus, responsible for forming and retrieving memories, has been compromised. He genuinely doesn't remember reading those books because the neural pathways that stored those memories have been destroyed. Every moment of forgetfulness, every inconsistency, every time Peter seems unaware of his own history, it's all evidence of deteriorating cognitive function. The unspoken tragedy. The darkest part of this theory is that nobody in the Griffin family acknowledges what's happening. Lois watches her husband become progressively stupider, more violent, more unstable, and just accepts it. She developed a brain tumor from repressing thoughts about being married to Peter, which means even her brain is trying to escape the reality of watching her husband deteriorate. Brian used to be the voice of reason, but even he gave up. The family just adapted to Peter's decline like it was normal. Like watching a man's brain destroy itself was acceptable background noise to their lives. The evidence is overwhelming. Peter Griffin used to be functional. Medical records prove it. He had jobs. He had relationships. He could think, plan, and execute ideas. Then came the IQ test showing a score of 70. Then came the stroke that paralyzed half his body. Then came decades of injuries that would hospitalize a normal person. And through it all, Peter got progressively dumber, meaner, more childish, more psychotic. This is not Flanderization. This is brain damage. This is what happens when a human skull endures repeated trauma without proper medical intervention. Peter's brain is dying, piece by piece, episode by episode, and Family Guy has been documenting the decline for over 20 years while playing it for laughs. The theory is this: every injury mattered, every concussion accumulated, every moment of head trauma chipped away at Peter's cognitive function until what remained was a shell of his former self, a man operating on damaged neural tissue, destroyed frontal lobes, and sheer cartoon physics. Peter Griffin is not stupid. Peter Griffin is brain damaged, and we've been watching him deteriorate since 1999. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Moses Griffin and Peter's Jewish ancestry. Moses, Griffin, and Peter's Jewish ancestry. Imagine discovering your family tree goes back to Moses. Not a guy named Moses who ran a deli in Brooklyn. The Moses. The Red Sea parting, 10 Commandments receiving, led the Jews out of Egypt, Moses. Now imagine that Moses had your exact face, your Rhode Island accent, and your complete inability to follow simple directions. Welcome to Peter Griffin's Ancestry, where one episode casually drops the bombshell that Peter might have hidden Jewish heritage alongside his confirmed Irish and African roots, creating the most ethnically complicated sitcom dad in television history. This is not a minor detail. This is genealogical chaos that suggests Peter Griffin is simultaneously Irish Catholic through Mickey McFinnigan, African American through Nate Griffin, and potentially Jewish through Moses Griffin. Peter is not just a melting pot, Peter is the melting pot. And the fandom has been quietly asking the same question for nearly 20 years. If Moses Griffin is canon, does that make Peter Griffin technically Jewish? The answer is complicated, theologically questionable, and absolutely hilarious. Let's dig into the Moses Griffin theory and figure out if Peter's been one awkward bar mitzvah away from completing his ethnic heritage trifecta this entire time. The episode that started everything, Untitled Griffin Family History, Season 4, Episode 27. Untitled Griffin Family History, also called The Griffin Family History, aired the 14th of May, 2006. The premise is simple. Robbers break into the Griffin house. The family flees to Peter's panic room, and to pass the time while trapped, Peter tells his family stories about their ancestors. This is where we meet the entire Griffin lineage in one condensed, historically inaccurate, absolutely bonkers episode. The stories start with the Big Bang, which was actually God farting through a lit lighter, because Family Guy treats theology with all the reverence of a whoopee cushion at a funeral. Then we jump to the Paleolithic age, where Peter invented the wheel. Standard Griffin excellence so far. But then we hit the Bronze Age, and that's where Moses Griffin enters the picture. Moses Griffin appears on screen leading the Israelites to freedom. He's parting the Red Sea. He's carrying stone tablets. He's doing all the Moses stuff you'd expect from Sunday school, except he looks exactly like Peter Griffin, sounds exactly like Peter Griffin, and displays the exact same level of competence you'd expect from a man whose IQ is 70. This is Peter's ancient Jewish ancestor, not metaphorically, not symbolically. The episode explicitly identifies Moses Griffin as Peter's lineage, which means somewhere in Peter's family tree, between the Irish Catholics and the African American slaves and the guy who invented the wheel, there's a Jewish prophet who wrote the 10 Commandments and saved God's chosen people. The fandom immediately had questions. Specifically, is this real? Does this count? Is Peter Griffin canonically Jewish? The 10 Commandments, Moses Griffin edition. Let's talk about what Moses Griffin actually did in the episode, because it's both historically significant and cosmically stupid. Moses Griffin is shown presenting the 10 Commandments to the Israelites wandering through the desert. Except these are not the biblical 10 Commandments. These are Moses Griffin's commandments, which include Commandment has shown, shut the hell up. Moses Griffin, fresh from speaking to God on Mount Sinai, comes down to deliver divine law, and his first commandment is telling everyone to shut up. Not, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Not, remember the Sabbath day. Just, shut the hell up, because apparently the Israelites were being too loud, and Moses Griffin had reached his limit. Commandment #2. There's nothing I can do about the Sunday. The people have been complaining about the heat. They've been wandering the desert for who knows how long. The sun is brutal. And Moses Griffin's response is to enshrine in divine law that he cannot, will not, and has no intention of doing anything about the Sunday. This is a commandment. God handed down stone tablets so Moses could tell people to stop asking him to fix the weather. Commandment #3. There are no more Jolly Ranchers, they're all gone. Moses Griffin brought Jolly Ranchers into the desert. The Israelites ate them all. Now Moses has to deal with people asking where the candy went, so he made it a commandment. The Jolly Ranchers are gone, stop asking, this is divine law now. This is what happens when you give Peter Griffin's ancestor the power to write permanent religious doctrine. Commandment #4. When we pass a billboard, please don't read it out loud. This is the one that breaks Moses. They're walking through the desert, there are billboards everywhere because Family Guy logic, and every single person reads them out loud. Danny Gans, Entertainer of the Year. Hassle-free checking, man cow in the morning. Moses Griffin begs them to stop. He makes it a commandment. They immediately ignore it and keep reading billboards anyway. These are not the 10 Commandments. These are the 4 commandments Moses Griffin actually cared about before giving up. The episode cuts away before we see the rest, which is probably for the best, because Commandment #5 was likely, stop asking when we're gonna get there, and Commandment #6 was probably, seriously, shut the hell up. The scene is played for laughs. It's a cutaway gag in an episode full of cutaway gags, but the implications are enormous. If Moses Griffin wrote the 10 Commandments, and Moses Griffin is Peter's ancestor, then Peter Griffin descends from Jewish lineage through one of the most important figures in Abrahamic tradition. The legitimacy question, does Moses Griffin actually count? Here's where the theory gets tricky. The show establishes multiple ancestors for Peter throughout the series, and not all of them are equally legitimate. Peter claims to descend from King Arthur Griffin, Ponce de Leon Griffin, Ulysses S. Griffin, and even Peter Hitler, Adolf's annoying younger brother, who accidentally killed him and made it look like suicide. Some of these are clearly gags, some are cutaway fantasies. Some are Peter just making things up. But Moses Griffin appears in Untitled Griffin Family History, an episode specifically dedicated to the Griffin family ancestry. This is not a random cutaway. This is Peter telling his family the actual history of their bloodline. Thelma Griffin is in the room. She's not correcting him. She's not saying, "Peter, that's not how it works." The episode treats Moses Griffin as legitimate Griffin family history. The fandom debates this constantly. Some argue that the entire episode is Peter making things up, that none of the ancestors are real, and Moses Griffin is just Peter's fantasy about being related to someone important. Others point out that Nate Griffin, the African-American slave who appears in the same episode, is confirmed canon in other episodes. Nate shows up again. He's referenced multiple times. He's established as real. If Nate Griffin is canon, Moses Griffin is canon. They appear in the same episode, told as part of the same family history, with the same level of narrative weight. You can't cherry-pick which ancestors count. Either they're all legitimate, or none of them are. And since Nate Griffin definitely counts, Peter has confirmed African ancestry through him, Moses Griffin counts too, which means Peter Griffin is descended from Jewish lineage. The question is, does that make Peter Jewish? The theological nightmare. Is Peter Griffin Jewish? Judaism is matrilineal. Jewish identity passes through the mother. If your mother is Jewish, you're Jewish. If your father is Jewish but your mother isn't, you're not Jewish unless you convert. This is established Jewish law, and it's been the standard for thousands of years. Moses Griffin is Peter's ancestor through the paternal line. Peter descends from Moses through fathers, not mothers. If we follow traditional Jewish law, this means Peter is not Jewish, even if Moses Griffin was, because the Jewish identity didn't pass down through the female lineage. But here's the problem. We don't know if Moses Griffin's lineage stayed matrilineal or patrilineal. We don't know if somewhere along the line, a Jewish woman married into the Griffin family and re-established the matrilineal connection. We have no idea how the Jewish heritage flowed through the generations because the show never explains it. What we do know is this. Moses Griffin existed, Moses Griffin was Jewish, he's literally Moses, and Moses Griffin is Peter's ancestor. That Jewish DNA is in Peter's genetic code somewhere, even if the religious identity doesn't technically apply under traditional Jewish law. Peter has Jewish ancestry. Whether that makes him Jewish depends on who you ask and which technicalities you want to argue. The episode Family Goy complicates this even further. In that episode, Peter discovers that Lois has Jewish ancestry and nearly shoots her while imitating a Nazi officer before Jesus appears and tells him to calm down. The episode deals explicitly with Jewish identity, and Peter's reaction suggests he doesn't consider himself Jewish. He's shocked to learn Lois might be Jewish. He doesn't say, "Oh yeah, I'm part Jewish too," through Moses Griffin. So either Peter forgot about Moses, Griffin entirely possible, given his brain damage, or Moses Griffin doesn't count for Jewish identity purposes, or the writers didn't care about continuity between episodes. All three options are equally plausible in Family Guy's universe. The ethnic trifecta: Irish, African, and Jewish. Let's map out Peter's confirmed ancestry because it's genuinely impressive how many ethnic backgrounds this one man has managed to accumulate. Irish heritage. Confirmed. Peter's biological father is Mickey McFinnigan, an Irishman. Peter was raised by Francis Griffin, his Irish-American Catholic stepfather. Peter's entire cultural identity is Irish-American Catholic. He drinks, he's got the accent, he's got the attitude. This is the most visible part of Peter's heritage, African-American heritage. Confirmed. Nate Griffin was Peter's great-great-great-great-grandfather, an African-American slave owned by the Pewter-Schmidt family. Nate had a relationship with Lois's ancestor, creating a genetic connection that makes Peter part African-American and creates the deeply uncomfortable reality that Peter and Lois's families were connected through slavery. This is canon. This is established. Peter has African ancestry, Jewish heritage, questionable, but probable. Moses Griffin led the Jews out of Egypt and wrote the Ten Commandments. If Moses Griffin is Peter's ancestor, and the episode suggests he is, then Peter has ancient Jewish lineage. Whether this counts for religious or cultural Jewish identity is debatable, but the genetic heritage is there. Peter Griffin is not just ethnically diverse, he's ethnically impossible. Irish, African, and Jewish heritage all converging in one Rhode Island man who can barely spell his own name. This is the genetic lottery, except the lottery is run by people who don't understand how genetics work and just threw random ancestries into a blender. The theory suggests that Peter is the ultimate American mutt, a walking Ellis Island of conflicting heritages that somehow produced a middle-aged man who works at a brewery and fights a giant chicken. Peter's DNA is a United Nations meeting where nobody speaks the same language, but they're all related somehow. The cultural implications, what this means for the Griffins. If Peter has Jewish ancestry, even questionable Moses Griffin ancestry, that means his children Meg, Chris, and Stewie also have Jewish heritage. Not enough to qualify for birthright Israel trips unless Lois's side provides the matrilineal connection, but enough to make their 2, 3, and me results absolutely fascinating. The Griffin kids are Irish through Mickey McFinnigan. They're African American through Nate Griffin, and they're potentially Jewish through Moses Griffin. Meg, Chris, and Stewie are walking identity crises who don't know about any of this because Peter never bothered to tell them about the Moses connection. Stewie, the genius baby, probably already knows. He's probably already run the genetic tests. He's probably already figured out that his family tree looks like a game of telephone played across 3 continents and 5,000 years of history. But Meg and Chris? They have no idea they're part of the most ethnically diverse bloodline in Quahog. This also creates some deeply awkward moments when you remember Peter's behavior. Peter has made anti-Semitic jokes. Peter has displayed casual racism. Peter has done things that would be wildly inappropriate if he knew about his own heritage. But he doesn't know, or he forgot, or he doesn't care, because Peter's relationship with self-awareness is non-existent. The Moses Griffin paradox. Why this theory matters. The Moses Griffin theory matters because it adds another layer to Peter's identity that he's completely unaware of. Peter walks through life thinking he's a simple Irish-American Catholic from Rhode Island. He has no idea he's descended from one of the most important figures in religious history. He has no idea he carries genetic heritage from 3 completely different ethnic and religious backgrounds. This is the ultimate Peter Griffin experience. Stumbling through life with no understanding of who he actually is, where he came from, or what his existence represents. Peter is a walking contradiction. He's Catholic but descended from Moses. He's white but has African ancestry. He's American but born in Mexico. Every aspect of Peter's identity is more complicated than it appears, and he's too oblivious to notice. The theory also raises questions about identity itself. If Peter has Jewish ancestry but doesn't practice Judaism, doesn't identify as Jewish, and doesn't even remember he's descended from Moses, does it count? Is heritage something you carry in your DNA, or is it something you actively participate in? Can you be ethnically Jewish without being religiously or culturally Jewish? These are big questions for a show about a talking baby and a dog who writes novels. But Family Guy, intentionally or not, stumbled into genuine philosophical territory by making Moses Griffin part of Peter's family tree. The evidence is there, sort of. The Moses Griffin theory works because the show established it, even if the show didn't fully think through the implications. Moses Griffin appeared in an episode dedicated to family history. He was presented as Peter's ancestor. He wrote the 10 Commandments poorly, but he wrote them. And nobody in the Griffin family, not even Brian, corrected Peter or suggested Moses. Griffin was made up. Compare this to other ancestors. Peter mentions King Arthur Griffin and Ponce de Leon Griffin, but those appear in obvious cutaway gags separate from the main family history episode. Moses Griffin appears in the actual family tree alongside Nate Griffin, who is confirmed canon. The show treats Moses Griffin as real within its own logic, even if that logic is insane. So yes, Peter Griffin probably has Jewish ancestry through Moses Griffin, Whether that makes Peter Jewish depends on your definition of Jewish identity, your interpretation of Family Guy canon, and how seriously you want to take an episode where God created the universe by farting through a lighter. The bottom line: Peter's hidden heritage. Peter Griffin is Irish, Peter Griffin is African American, and Peter Griffin is probably Jewish. His family tree contains Moses, slaves, Irishmen, and people who wrote the 10 Commandments while running out of Jolly Ranchers. This is canon until the show explicitly contradicts it, and given Family Guy's relationship with continuity, that might never happen. The Moses Griffin theory is this: Peter has hidden Jewish heritage that he doesn't know about, doesn't understand, and would probably forget about 5 minutes after someone explained it to him. Somewhere in his genetic code, buried beneath the Irish Catholic upbringing and the brain damage and the 70 IQ, Peter Griffin carries the blood of Moses. And Moses Griffin's legacy lives on in Peter's complete inability to follow directions, his tendency to complain about everything, and his skill at leading people into disasters they absolutely should have seen coming. Like ancestor, like descendant, Peter Griffin might be Jewish. He just doesn't know it yet. And honestly, he probably never will. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Peter's lost children theory. Peter's lost children theory. Most people know Peter Griffin has 3 kids: Meg, Chris, and Stewie. The holy trinity of Griffin offspring who've survived long enough to become series regulars. What most people don't realize is that Peter has fathered enough children to populate a small European country, and the vast majority of them are either dead, forgotten, or living in the sewers of Quahog as human alligator rat hybrids. Welcome to the Lost Children Theory, the darkest family planning story in animation history, where we catalog every Griffin child who didn't make it to the opening credits. This is not speculation. This is canon. The show has explicitly confirmed that Peter has multiple deceased children, hundreds of living sperm donation offspring, and enough genetic material floating around Quahog to create entirely new species. Peter Griffin is not just a father of 3. Peter Griffin is a walking biological disaster who's left a trail of abandoned children across Rhode Island like some kind of deadbeat Johnny Appleseed. Let's count the bodies, shall we? Because once you start adding up Peter's offspring, the dead ones, the living ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who tried to kill Stewie, the number gets uncomfortable fast. Peter Griffin Jr., the shaken baby syndrome victim. Let's start with the most tragic: Peter Griffin Jr., the son who shares Peter's name, the child who should have carried on the Griffin legacy, the baby who died because Peter shook him too hard and couldn't figure out why he wouldn't stop crying. Peter Griffin Jr.'s grave appears in Season 7, Episode 9, The Juice is Loose, just sitting there in a graveyard scene. A tombstone with Peter's son's name on it, confirming what the show had hinted at before. Peter killed his own infant son through sheer incompetence. The Family Guy wiki states it plainly: Peter shook him until he stopped crying, killing him. Think about that sentence. Peter shook his baby to death. Not in a cutaway gag. Not in a dream sequence. Peter actually had a son named Peter Griffin Jr., and that son died because Peter, a man with an IQ of 70, and the parenting skills of a concussed orangutan, thought shaking an infant was a valid childcare strategy. The show treats this with its trademark dark humor, but the implications are horrifying. Peter killed his own child and faced 0 legal consequences, no investigation, no charges, no child protective services removing the other children from the home. Peter just moved on, had more kids, named another one Stewie. Business as usual at 31 Spooner Street. In Season 9, Episode 10, The Giggity Wife, Peter even admits to shaking Stewie, noting that Lois is unhappy because it resulted in Stewie's unusual gait. The unusual gait we all recognize, Stewie's walk, that distinctive baby waddle. According to Peter, that's brain damage from being shaken. Peter has now injured TWO children through shaking, killed one, and nobody stopped him. The theory goes that Peter Griffin Jr. was probably born somewhere around 2000, making him chronologically older than Stewie, but dead long before Stewie's conception. Peter and Lois had another child. That child died, they buried him, and then just kept having babies, like nothing happened. The Griffins treated infant death like a minor inconvenience and immediately replaced him with Stewie. Peter Griffin Jr. is the forgotten Griffin, the lost son. The child whose death should have been a wake-up call, but instead became a footnote in Peter's long history of catastrophically bad decisions. Dave Griffin, Stewie's twin, killed in the womb. If Peter Griffin Jr.'s death was tragic negligence, Dave Griffin's death was premeditated murder. Dave was Stewie's twin brother. They shared a womb, they were developing side by side. And then Stewie, even as a fetus, decided Dave had to die. Wikipedia confirms this. Peter has 3 deceased children: Peter Jr., who was shaken to death; Dave, Stewie's twin, who is implied to have been killed by Stewie during childbirth. The phrasing is critical, implied to have been killed by Stewie. The show never explicitly shows this, but the implication is clear. Stewie murdered his own twin brother before they were even born. This tracks with Stewie's character. Stewie is a genius. Stewie builds death rays and time machines. Stewie has killed numerous people throughout the series. The idea that Stewie, even in utero, had the cognitive ability and murderous intent to eliminate his twin is not just plausible, it's completely in character. But think about what this means for Lois. She was pregnant with twins. She went into labor expecting 2 babies. She came out with one. Somewhere in that delivery room, Dave Griffin died, and the doctors had to explain to Lois that one of her twins didn't make it. She named him Dave. She mourned him, and then she went home with Stewie, the surviving twin, completely unaware that her baby genius had committed fratricide in the womb. Dave Griffin never got a gravestone, never got an episode, never even got a cutaway gag. He was mentioned once, confirmed as Stewie's dead twin, and then forgotten. Stewie killed his brother before taking his first breath, and nobody talks about it. Timas, Chris's stillborn twin. Wikipedia also mentions a 3rd deceased child. Timas, Chris's stillborn twin brother. This one's even more obscure. Timas, apparently pronounced like Thomas, without the ho, was Chris's twin who died before birth, stillborn. Never made it out of the womb alive. This means Lois has lost TWO twins. Dave died with Stewie. Timas died with Chris. Lois has experienced twin pregnancy twice, and both times, one of the twins died. The odds of this happening once are tragic. The odds of this happening twice suggest either supernatural bad luck or something deeply wrong with Lois's pregnancies. Or, and here's the dark theory, maybe it's genetic. Maybe Griffin twins are cursed. Maybe every time Lois conceives twins, one of them is destined to die. Stewie murdered Dave. But what killed Timas? Was it another case of twin-on-twin violence in the womb? Did Chris, as a fetus, accidentally or deliberately kill his brother? We'll never know because the show never explains it. Timas is a name, a death, and a footnote. Another dead Griffin child that nobody talks about. Bertram, the sperm bank nemesis. Now we get to the children who survived, starting with Bertram, Stewie's half-brother and arch-nemesis. Bertram is special because he's not just alive, he actively tried to erase Stewie from existence by killing Leonardo da Vinci in Renaissance Italy, which would have destroyed the universe. Standard sibling rivalry stuff. Bertram was born through artificial insemination. 2 women, a gym teacher and her partner, wanted a child, went to a sperm bank, and unknowingly used Peter Griffin's sperm. This happened because Peter, in Season 4, Episode 22, Sibling Rivalry, went to freeze his sperm before getting a vasectomy, accidentally destroyed all the samples in the sperm bank, and replaced them with his own to cover up the mistake. Peter filled entire shelves with his sperm. The sperm bank didn't notice. Women kept getting inseminated with Peter Griffin's genetic material, thinking they were getting samples from their chosen donors. Bertram was the result, a baby genius born to lesbian parents, sharing Peter's DNA, and inheriting the intelligence and megalomania that skipped Peter entirely, but somehow went to Stewie. Bertram first appears in Season 3, Episode 11, Mission Impossible, where he's still a sperm, fighting Stewie, also a sperm at the time, inside Peter's body. They become frenemies. Then, in Sibling Rivalry, Bertram is born and immediately declares war on Stewie for control of the playground. Their final battle happens in Season 9, Episode 16, The Big Bang Theory. where Bertram tries to kill Da Vinci, Stewie kills Bertram with a crossbow to the head, and the universe barely survives. Bertram is dead now. Stewie killed him. But for several seasons, Peter had a biological son he didn't raise, didn't know about, and never claimed. Bertram shares Peter's DNA but grew up in a completely different family, and Peter never once acknowledged him as his child. A House Full of Peters, The Sperm Donation, Apocalypse. Season 15, Episode 20, A House Full of Peters, drops the nuclear bomb on Peter's parenting record. The episode reveals that Peter, before marrying Lois, frequently donated sperm to raise money. Not once, not twice, frequently. Peter was a regular at the Quahog Sperm Bank, selling his genetic material to fund important purchases like dial-up modem impression lessons. The episode's plot is simple. Lois pranks Peter by pretending to be his long-lost daughter. Peter panics and hangs up. Lois follows him to the sperm bank and discovers the truth. Peter has hundreds of biological children out there, maybe thousands. The show never gives an exact number, but when Peter agrees to let his sperm donation offspring contact him, a massive crowd shows up at his house. Hundreds of people. All ages, sizes, races, genders, nationalities. Every single one of them looks like Peter. They all have his face. The strong family resemblance crosses every genetic boundary. There are black women who look like Peter. German men who look like Peter. Children, teenagers, young adults all sharing Peter's distinctive features because Peter's genes are apparently so dominant that they override everything else. One of them is Larry, a young man in his early 20s who looks exactly like Peter did at that age. Larry is charming, helpful, polite, everything Peter used to be before the brain damage set in. Lois finds herself attracted to Larry. They kiss, Peter catches them, and they have a brutal fight where Larry nearly kills his biological father before Lois knocks him out with a flower pot. By the end of the episode, all the children leave. Peter promises to stop donating sperm and pledges to flush all future emissions down the sink. The camera then shifts to the sewers beneath Quahog, where we see alligators, rats, and alligator-rat hybrids, all with Peter's face sharing his distinctive laugh. Peter's genetic material has created new species. His sperm, flushed into the sewers, has mixed with the local wildlife and produced half-human hybrids. Peter has not just fathered hundreds of human children, he's created an entire ecosystem of Peter-faced sewer creatures. He's done to Quahog what the Chernobyl disaster did to Pripyat, except instead of radiation, it's his DNA. The forgotten count. How many children does Peter have? Let's tally this up because the number is staggering. Confirmed living, Meg, Chris, Stewie, Dre. Confirmed dead, Peter Griffin Jr., Dave, Timos, 3. Confirmed sperm donation children, Bertram, dead. Hundreds from A House Full of Peters, alive but estranged. Sewer mutants, unknown number of human alligator rat hybrids. Cutaway gag offspring, various children mentioned or shown in cutaways throughout the series. The conservative estimate puts Peter's child count at over 200. The realistic estimate puts it closer to 500 or more. Peter Griffin has fathered more children than Genghis Khan, and approximately 99% of them either died, got abandoned, or mutated into sewer monsters. Peter has 3 children in his house, 3 children he actually raises. The rest? Gone, dead, forgotten, living in other families who used sperm donations, lurking in sewers, fighting Stewie for playground dominance. Peter's reproductive legacy is a horror show of abandonment and biological chaos that makes Maury Povich's paternity test episodes look quaint. The theory: Peter doesn't know how many kids he has. The lost children theory suggests that Peter has genuinely lost count of his offspring. He doesn't know about most of them. He's forgotten the dead ones. He never knew about the sperm donation children until they showed up at his door. And he definitely doesn't know about the sewer mutants. Peter's IQ of 70 means he probably can't do the math. 3 kids at home, plus 3 dead kids, plus hundreds of sperm donation kids, plus unknown sewer creatures, equals a number Peter's brain cannot compute. He's a father to hundreds, but he can only conceptualize 3. The rest exist in a cognitive blind spot, where Peter's limited mental capacity prevents him from grasping the scale of his reproductive impact. This explains why Peter treats fatherhood so casually. He's killed children before, and nothing happened. He's abandoned hundreds of children and faced no consequences. Peter's relationship with parenthood is transactional and disposable because his brain cannot hold the weight of what he's done. Every dead child is forgotten. Every abandoned child is someone else's problem. Every sewer mutant is just another thing Peter doesn't think about. The theory also suggests that more children could appear at any time. A house full of Peters established that Peter's sperm is out there, in sperm banks, creating new children as recently as 2017. Some of Peter's offspring haven't been born yet. Some are still embryos. Some haven't even been conceived because the vials are still frozen, waiting for couples who want children. Peter Griffin's genetic legacy is still expanding. Right now, somewhere in Quahog, a couple might be selecting a sperm sample that will create another Peter-faced child who'll grow up never knowing their biological father is a brain-damaged brewery worker who once fought a chicken for 10 minutes. The bottom line, Peter is a biological weapon. The lost children theory is this. Peter Griffin has fathered hundreds of children, killed multiple infants through negligence, created new species through improper sperm disposal, and has absolutely no idea how many offspring carry his DNA. His children include the living, the dead, the forgotten, the vengeful, and the genetically impossible. Meg, Chris, and Stewie are the lucky ones. They survived. They got to stay in the house. They have a family, dysfunctional as it is. But for every Griffin child in the opening credits, there are 100 more who weren't so fortunate. Some died in the womb. Some died in Peter's arms. Some grew up in other families wondering why they look like a middle-aged Rhode Island man they've never met. Some live in sewers, half human and half animal, laughing with Peter's voice. Peter Griffin's reproductive legacy is a graveyard and a phone book simultaneously. 3 children, he claims. 300, he doesn't. And somewhere in Quahog's sewer system, his descendants are evolving. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to the immortal punchline theory, Peter Griffin can't die. The immortal punchline theory, Peter Griffin can't die. On the surface, Peter Griffin is just a bumbling, overweight, intellectually disabled man who somehow survives things no ordinary human ever could. But what if there's more to it? What if Peter Griffin is literally immortal, or at least trapped in a death-proof cartoon existence that the show itself hints at? What if every impossible survival, every reset, every return from oblivion isn't just cartoon physics, but evidence that Peter Griffin exists in a state of forced eternal comedy, unable to die, because the universe itself demands his continued suffering for the sake of the joke? This isn't just a theory about cartoon logic, it's a theory about cosmic horror disguised as sitcom humor. The chicken fights, a case study in immortality. Let's start with the most obvious evidence, Peter's legendary battles with Ernie the giant chicken. Their rivalry began over something absurdly trivial, an expired coupon in Season 2's Da Boom, and has since evolved into one of Family Guy's most infamous recurring gags. Each fight level's entire city blocks, includes falls from planes and buildings, and causes massive destruction and casualties to bystanders. But here's what's genuinely disturbing. Both combatants survive everything. Ernie has been chopped up by airplane propellers, spoofing Raiders of the Lost Ark, hanged, pierced, roasted by rocket engines, fallen from skyscrapers, crashed through buildings, been deep-fried, drowned, and even had his head blown off by a shotgun when he mistook the Peter Terminator for the real Peter. After every single fight, Peter seemingly kills Ernie in some gruesome way, walks away battered and bruised, picks up the conversation where he left off, and then the camera cuts back to show Ernie's eye opening, foreshadowing another future fight. It was even suggested in New Kidney in Town that Ernie was accidentally created in a lab by Dr. Hartman, who tried to clone a chicken but ended up creating a hostile man-sized chicken that escaped. When the story was relayed, Peter said they would have to discuss it later, implying Peter might know more about Ernie's origins than he lets on. Think about what this means. These fights involve car chases, train battles, boat crashes, subway brawls, construction sites, airplanes, and Ferris wheels. Peter and Ernie beat each other with trash cans, mailboxes, fire hydrants, and even human beings. Ernie hijacks cars and runs Peter over repeatedly. Peter beats Ernie to a hideous bloody pulp to make sure he's dead, and yet they both survive every single time. Any normal human would be paste. Any normal chicken would be McNuggets. But not Peter, not Ernie. They exist in a state of enforced combat immortality, doomed to fight forever because the joke demands it. And here's the darkest twist. In season 23's The Chicken or the Meg, it was Meg, not Peter, who finally killed Ernie, decapitating him after he gave her an ultimatum to renounce Peter or stop dating his son Nugget. For the first time in 25 years of chicken fights, Ernie's eye didn't open at the end. Executive producers confirmed he's dead for real. But if Ernie was truly immortal like Peter, how did Meg kill him? The answer is simple. Meg isn't bound by the same cosmic rules. She's not the joke anchor. She's expendable, forgotten, abused, which paradoxically gives her freedom. She can change, she can kill. Peter can't. Peter is trapped in his immortality, forced to relive the same violent cycles forever. The apocalypse can't touch him. In Da-Boom, the world literally ends due to Y2K, causing a nuclear holocaust. Planes fall from the sky, trains derail, and nuclear warheads launch worldwide, destroying most of civilization and mutating or killing most inhabitants. Peter's paranoia about Y2K saves his family when he locks them in the basement in hazmat suits. The Griffins remain safe while Quahog is annihilated. Kevin Swanson gets vaporized by the nuclear blast. It's implied that Bonnie also perished. Tom Tucker and Diane Simmons resort to cannibalism, having literally barbecued Asian reporter Trisha Takanawa. Cleveland and Quagmire are stitched together. The world becomes a radioactive wasteland. And Peter, he's fine. Not just alive, he's thriving. After eating all their emergency food supplies without adding water to the dehydrated meals, Peter leads the family to Natick, Massachusetts, betting that a Twinkie factory survived the Holocaust. He's right. He establishes himself as mayor of New Quahog and leads the town council. He survives nuclear fallout like it's a mild inconvenience. When Peter gets paranoid about the town's safety and makes guns from the irrigation pipes, the townspeople throw the Griffins out. Just as the town destroys the guns, Stewie's mutant offspring hatch and massacre everyone in New Quahog. Once again, Peter's seemingly stupid decision saves the family from certain death. See the pattern? The universe bends itself around Peter's survival. His stupidity isn't stupidity, it's prophetic. His decisions, no matter how moronic, somehow always keep him alive. It's like reality itself is rigged in his favor, ensuring he can never escape the cycle. Cutaway gags, the death-proof evidence. Here's where the theory gets truly meta. Family Guy Wiki explicitly states that cutaway gags are implied to be simply stories made up by the people that set up the gag, and that the incidents shown did not really happen. This is particularly obvious when it comes to parodies of movies and television shows, or incidents that show a character dying. So, cutaways aren't real. They're fictional stories within a fictional show. But here's the thing, Peter dies in dozens of cutaways. He's burned alive, shot, exploded, flattened, dismembered, eaten, crushed, and every single time, he reappears in the next scene completely unharmed, as if nothing happened. Family Guy is infamous for its extensive use of cutaway gags, with most episodes containing several. They're often introduced with, "This is better than divided by, worse than divided by, just like the time that" format, allowing virtually anything to be slotted in anywhere. Some cutaways last only seconds, others go on for minutes. The show even became self-aware about this. In Spies Reminiscent of Us, Stewie gets knocked out and tries to set up a cutaway by mumbling incoherently before losing consciousness, leading to him standing in an empty white room, complaining that he has no idea what gag he was setting up for. In Back to the Woods, James Woods threatens Peter with activating a cutaway gag if he doesn't leave, and Peter flees in terror. But think about what this means on a deeper level. If cutaways are fictional within the show's reality, that means Peter's deaths in cutaways never happened. which means Peter has a 100% survival rate across infinite scenarios. He's narratively unkillable. The show's own meta structure confirms his immortality. And here's the truly disturbing part. In Back to the Pilot, when Stewie and Brian time travel back to the pilot episode, instead of reusing the pilot's cutaways, it shows that during the gags, the characters just sort of awkwardly stand in place and wait for them to finish. Peter is aware of the cutaways. He knows he's trapped in narrative loops. He knows he dies and returns, and he just stands there, waiting, because he has no choice. He's the punchline, and the punchline can't end. Physical impossibilities that just work. Let's catalog some of Peter's other impossible survivals. Toxic waste and radiation. In Family Guy viewer, Mail has shown, the Griffins get doused in toxic waste and gain superpowers. They terrorize Quahog with their abilities. Stewie grows an enlarged brain. Lois gains super strength and crushes cars and people. Chris sets his high school on fire. Meg grows her fingernails to attack people. Mayor Adam West tries to fight them by rolling around in toxic waste himself, but instead of gaining powers, he develops lymphoma and ends up hospitalized. Peter? He gets superpowers and eventually just stops using them. No cancer, no radiation sickness, just back to normal. Alcohol poisoning. In Wasted Talent, Peter participates in a brewery tour and drinks so much beer he should have died 10 times over from alcohol poisoning. Instead, he wins tickets to a tour of the Pawtucket Brewery by belching up a golden ticket. His liver should be a shriveled raisin. It's not. He just keeps drinking, episode after episode, year after year, with zero consequences. The PTV incident. In PTV, after the FCC starts censoring everything in Quahog following a controversial wardrobe malfunction at the Emmys, Peter builds his own TV network from literal garbage. When the FCC shuts him down and starts censoring real life, Peter withstands having a censor's bar physically pulled over his genitals by FCC employees as he leaves the shower. Think about that. They physically manifested a censor bar in reality and placed it on his body. That should violate every law of physics. Peter just shrugs it off. The boneless incident, in No Bones About It, from Family Guy viewer, Mail has shown, Peter gets 3 wishes from a genie. One wish goes horribly wrong and removes all his bones, turning him into a shapeless blob. Any human would be dead. Instantly, your organs need skeletal support, your heart needs a rib cage, your brain needs a skull. Peter just flops around as a boneless blob, gets dirty, takes 12 baths a day, moves to Los Angeles, becomes a human cushion for stuntmen, and eventually gets an experimental surgery to restore his skeleton using his family's donated bones. He ends up horribly misshapen but alive. A normal person would have died in step 1. Hurricane survival. In The Perfect Castaway, Peter's fishing boat gets destroyed by a hurricane while he's desperately trying to catch more fish at a private island. The boat named the SS, more powerful than Superman, Batman, Spider-Man, and the Incredible Hulk put together, is completely obliterated. Peter survives a hurricane at sea with no boat. He just washes ashore and goes to the unemployment office to find a new job. Carbon monoxide poisoning. In one episode, Peter accidentally poisons his entire family with carbon monoxide. They all die. All of them, Lois, Meg, Chris, Stewie, Brian, and Peter himself. And then they all just come back. Revived. No explanation. Death isn't permanent for Peter Griffin. It's a commercial break. The pattern emerges. Notice something? Every single catastrophe follows the same formula. Peter does something monumentally stupid. Reality-ending consequences occur. Peter survives against all odds. Everything resets by the next episode. It's not luck. It's not cartoon physics. It's structural immortality. Peter Griffin cannot die because the show cannot exist without him. He is the axis around which Family Guy rotates. Remove Peter, and the entire universe collapses. But here's where it gets darker. Peter seems aware of this on some level. The meta-awareness. Peter knows he's trapped. Throughout the series, Peter demonstrates an uncomfortable awareness of his own fictional nature. In PTV, After winning an argument with Lois about censorship, Peter celebrates by opening a secret compartment in the ceiling containing balloons, streamers, confetti, and a banner reading "Peter's right." He claims he set this up 15 years ago, suggesting he's been waiting over a decade for this single moment of victory. That's not normal behavior. That's the behavior of someone who knows the script, who knows the beats, who's counting down the episodes until his moment arrives. In Back to the Woods, when James Woods threatens to activate a cutaway gag, Peter flees in genuine terror, not annoyance, terror. He's afraid of the cutaways. He knows what they do to him. He knows he'll die and return, and no one will remember. In multiple episodes, Peter directly addresses the audience, breaks the fourth wall, acknowledges Fox Network executives, and even references the show's cancellation and revival. He's not just a character, he's a prisoner who knows he's a prisoner. And the cruelest part? No one else seems to notice or care. Lois doesn't question why Peter survives nuclear war. Brian doesn't ask how Peter regenerates from being boneless. The family just accepts it, because they're not real. They're props in Peter's eternal punishment. The cosmic joke: why Peter can't die. So why is Peter immortal? The answer is both simple and horrifying. Peter Griffin is the punchline, and the punchline cannot end. Family Guy is structured around Peter's suffering. Every episode, he humiliates himself, destroys something, causes chaos, faces consequences, and then nothing changes. He's back at the Drunken Clam next week, back at the brewery, back in the same house, same family, same life, an infinite loop of degradation. The universe of Family Guy exists solely to extract comedy from Peter's pain. His stupidity, his failures, his violence, his near deaths, they're all fuel for the joke machine. And the machine cannot run without fuel. So Peter is kept alive, kept stupid, kept suffering, forever. This explains several disturbing patterns. Why Quahog always resets. The town can be destroyed, nuked, burned, flooded, but by next episode, it's pristine. Because the joke needs Quahog. The joke needs the Drunken Clam. The joke needs Peter's house. So reality restructures itself around the joke's requirements. Why Meg is abused. Meg isn't the joke anchor. She's expendable. Her suffering doesn't matter to the cosmic structure, which is why everyone can mock her, hurt her, forget her. She's not protected like Peter. But she's also not imprisoned like Peter. She could theoretically change, grow, leave. Peter can't. Why Brian dies and returns. In season 12, Brian is killed by a car and replaced with Vinny, a new dog. Fans revolted. The show brought Brian back via time travel. Why? Because the show tried to change the formula and the audience, the true gods of this universe, rejected it. Peter's reality is determined by audience demand. He cannot escape because we won't let him. Why Stewie never succeeds. Stewie builds time machines, multiverse devices, weather control rays, death rays technology that should fundamentally alter reality. None of it sticks. By next episode, it's gone. Because Stewie's inventions threaten the joke structure. They threaten Peter's loop. So they're erased. Why Peter's jobs always reset. Peter has had hundreds of jobs. President of a cigarette company, president of his own country, Pretoria, police officer, fisherman, Ghostbuster, New England Patriots player, meth dealer, school principal. Every job ends in disaster, and Peter ends up back at Pawtucket Brewery. Not because he's rehired, because the universe forces him back into position. The brewery is where Peter belongs in the joke structure, so that's where he always ends up. The horror of eternal comedy. Here's the final darkest layer. Peter Griffin's immortality isn't a gift, it's a curse. He's trapped in an endless cycle of humiliation, violence, and reset. He's aware enough to know something is wrong, but not aware enough to escape. He's the Sisyphus of sitcoms, pushing the boulder of comedy up the hill forever, watching it roll back down, and starting again. Every chicken fight is the same fight. Every nuclear war is the same war. Every death is the same death. He's not living, he's repeating. An eternal return with no escape, no growth, no change. Just the joke, forever. And we, the audience, are his jailers. We demand the chicken fights. We demand the cutaways. We demand Peter stays stupid, stays violent, stays Peter. The moment he evolves, the moment he changes, the moment he becomes something other than the punchline, we change the channel. So Peter Griffin can't die, not because he's strong, or lucky, or protected by cartoon physics, but because we need him to suffer. The joke demands it, the structure demands it, and Peter, aware of his role but powerless to change it, walks into his next disaster, knowing he'll survive it, knowing he'll be back, knowing the loop will never end. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.